There was a woman in every family who could stretch a dollar until it hollered. She kept a jar of bacon grease next to the stove, a pot of beans on the back burner, and she fed everybody who walked through that door. Your grandmother, your great aunt, the lady down the street who never let a child go hungry. They did not have much, but they turned neck bones and cornmeal and whatever was left in the garden into meals that held a family together through layoffs, through Jim Crow, through winters that felt like they would never end. Some of these dishes came out of sharecropper kitchens in Mississippi. Others were born in the projects of Chicago and Detroit, where Southern women carried their recipes north and made do with what the corner store had. Most of them cost almost nothing. All of them kept people alive. Here are 100 cheap soul food meals our Black grandmothers made to survive. Number 20, dropping a clean copper penny into the greens pot to keep the color bright. A Sunday afternoon in Macon, Georgia, 1948. The collards had been picked from the garden that morning, the stems stripped, the leaves stacked and rolled and sliced into ribbons. Big Mama dropped them into the pot with a smoked turkey neck, a splash of cider vinegar, and a single Lincoln penny scrubbed bright with a slice of lemon. The greens cooked 2.5 hours. The copper held the green pigment in the leaves, so the pot came out emerald instead of army drab. She fished the penny out with a slotted spoon before serving and dropped it back into the cleaning jar by the sink. Modern cookbooks tell you to skip this trick because they're worried about leaching. Your Big Mama would tell you a clean penny and a clean pot for 2 hours never killed a soul, and the greens still tasted like Sunday. Number 20, pig feet. Slow simmered until the skin went to silk and the bones gave up their richness. Pig feet were a poor table's luxury. They were boiled for hours with vinegar and pepper, sometimes pickled in a jar and eaten cold, sometimes served hot and falling apart over rice. Like so much of soul food, the feet were an offcut the enslaved were left with and turned into something worth waiting all day for. They carried the same official suspicion as the other raw pork parts during the 1960s sanitation campaigns, since handling fresh trotters meant handling raw hog that could carry bacteria into the kitchen. Health departments of the era pressed the message of careful cleaning and thorough cooking for all such cuts, the same drumbeat aimed at chitlins and maws. Cooks already knew to boil the feet long and hard until the meat all but melted, and they kept right on doing it. The warnings worried about the bacteria, but the pot kept its promise. Number 19, liver and onions. By 1984, beef liver was selling for under $1 a pound at most Black neighborhood grocery stores in cities like Cleveland and Baltimore, the cheapest cut sitting on the meat case. 2 large yellow onions were sliced thin and cooked low and slow in bacon grease until they turned the color of weak coffee and the kitchen filled with the sweet caramel smell. The liver was patted dry with paper towels, dusted in seasoned flour, heavy with black pepper, and dropped in the same skillet 3 minutes aside, no longer than that. Overcooking turned it to shoe leather, and every Black grandmother had a daughter she had trained out of that mistake the hard way. Served with mashed potatoes and a tall glass of cold buttermilk, it was the iron-rich meal that doctors kept telling Black families with anemia to eat more often. Liver and onions was medicine that tasted like supper. Number 19, raw unpasteurized milk. Before the refrigerated truck and the grocery dairy case, country families drank their milk straight from the cow and they let it sit and sour on purpose. That soured milk became clabber, thick and tangy, spooned up plain or stirred into cornbread and biscuits across the rural South. Real buttermilk came the same honest way. Raw milk was the foundation of half the baking in a poor kitchen, but unpasteurized milk can carry listeria, E. coli, and salmonella, and the sicknesses it caused were severe, sometimes deadly, especially in the young and the old. So the agency drew a hard line. In 1987, the FDA banned the sale of raw milk across state lines, requiring pasteurization for any milk shipped in interstate commerce. The clabber and the true buttermilk did not vanish, but the easy supply of raw milk that fed those traditions was cut off by federal rule, pushing a cornerstone of country cooking to the margins. Number 19, hoe cake. The name was literal. Before the American Revolution, enslaved field workers cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. There was no kitchen, no oven, no table. There was a tool meant for digging, repurposed for cooking, because it was the only flat piece of metal within reach. The earliest written references appear in Virginia plantation records from the 1700s, where overseers noted that enslaved people baked cakes on their hoes during midday breaks. By the early 1800s, hoe cake had migrated indoors. Cast iron griddles replaced the hoe blade, and the recipe appeared in nearly every Southern cookbook published before the Civil War. But the name stuck. Hoe cake, a word that carries inside it the full history of Black cooking in America, making something nourishing out of almost nothing, using tools that were never designed for the purpose. The batter itself was the simplest thing imaginable. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, cooked flat until the edges browned. Some versions added a spoonful of lard. Some added buttermilk, but the original needed nothing more than meal, water, and heat. Abraham Lincoln reportedly ate hoe cakes as a child in Kentucky. Frederick Douglass wrote about them. The dish crossed every line of class and color in the antebellum South. And then it vanished. Not because it stopped tasting good, but because the name reminded people of something the country wanted to forget. The garden hoe hanging in the shed became just a garden tool again. The cake baked on it became just cornbread, and the people who invented it became a footnote in someone else's cookbook. Number 17, mush with sweet milk for breakfast or supper. Cornmeal porridge, the kind enslaved people in the Carolinas had eaten 3 times a day, was still on supper tables in Black senior apartments in 1979 because it cost about a nickel a bowl and went down easy on bad teeth. A grandmother in Charleston in her late 70s would stir a half cup of fine yellow meal into 2 cups of boiling salted water, whisking until it thickened to a soft pudding. She poured it into a bowl while still steaming, then floated a 1/4 cup of cold whole milk on top with a pinch of sugar. The hot mush met the cold milk and made 2 textures in 1 spoonful. Sometimes she added a spoon of preserves from a mason jar her sister had sent up from Edisto Island. Number 17 on this list was breakfast, supper, or both, depending on what the icebox held that week. The dish carried her through the long stretch between Social Security deposits. Poverty does not care where your people came from. Number 20, sweet potato pancakes with sorghum. Leftover sweet potatoes from Sunday dinner almost always ended up on Tuesday's griddle, smashed into pancakes thick with sorghum syrup. The potatoes from Sunday got mashed cold with a fork, then mixed with a half cup of flour, 1 egg, and just enough buttermilk to loosen the batter. A small ladle poured the mix onto a hot, greased griddle, and the cakes came up orange-brown with crisp, lacy edges. The sorghum bottle sat on the table because it cost less than maple syrup and held more flavor in 1 spoon. Black families across the South kept a jug of sorghum on the shelf year-round, since 1 gallon could last from October planting to April plowing. The pancakes filled up a child fast, used food that would have gone bad by Wednesday, and tasted like dessert in the middle of a hard week. Number 14, sweet potato and peanut stew. This meal came straight from West Africa and survived the Middle Passage and 200 years of American history to end up in a pot on a stove in the Mississippi Delta. A senior would peel and cube sweet potatoes, drop them in a pot with a spoonful of peanut butter, onions, a can of tomatoes, and enough water to make a broth. An hour of simmering turned it into a thick, creamy stew that was sweet and savory at the same time. A retired cotton picker named Bessie Ruth Williams in Indianola, Mississippi, made this every Thursday from a recipe her grandmother taught her. Her grandmother had learned it from her own grandmother, who had been born enslaved. The recipe never changed. 4 generations of women made the same stew in the same kind of pot. A jar of peanut butter cost 45 cents in 1965. Sweet potatoes grew in the yard. Nobody called it African food. They just called it supper. Number 16, pork brains and scrambled eggs. This one made you look twice. A woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, would open a can of pork brains in milk gravy, rinse them, chop them, and scramble them into eggs with salt and pepper. The texture was soft, almost creamy, and the taste was mild enough that children ate it without knowing what it was. In the 1950s, canned pork brains were a common item on grocery store shelves across the South. They cost almost nothing. A single can could stretch a few eggs into a meal for 4 people. This was arithmetic. This was survival. By the 1970s, cholesterol warnings started pushing organ meats off the American plate. By the 1990s, most grocery stores had stopped stocking canned brains altogether. But in the decades before that, this was a breakfast that kept families full until supper with ingredients that cost less than a quarter. Your grandmother did not waste a single part of the animal. That was not a choice. That was a principle. Fermented chow chow. End of summer. A wooden table on a porch in rural Tennessee in 1944. Baskets of green tomatoes and cabbage and onion and peppers waiting to be chopped. A cook packed the cut vegetables into a stoneware crock with salt and pressed them down with a clean stone, then waited 2 weeks. The lacto fermentation created the same lactobacilli now sold as probiotic capsules at $28 a bottle. A 2018 study found that home fermented vegetables carry live bacteria counts comparable to commercial probiotics. A jar of chow chow on a wooden shelf in a Tennessee root cellar in 1944 was already that. Nothing has changed about the recipe. The science finally caught up to the canning jar. The same bacteria that wellness companies bottle and sell back to the people whose grandmothers had been making them in crocks for centuries. The bacteria don't care about the bottle. They never did. Her crock didn't need one. Number 9, pound cake. In a black church, being known as the woman who made the best pound cake was a title that outranked deacon. It was earned through decades of perfection, and the recipe died with you unless you chose to pass it on. The Easter pound cake followed the original formula: 1 pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. No baking powder, no baking soda, no leavening at all. The rise came entirely from beating air into the eggs by hand. 30 to 45 minutes of beating before electric mixers became common in the 1950s. That was 1 pound of butter, 4 sticks, about 8 to 10 eggs. Among Gullah Geechee communities in the South Carolina Lowcountry, pound cake recipes were never written down. They were memorized through years of watching and helping. Ron Dace, a Gullah Geechee cultural preservationist from St. Helena Island, has worked to document these recipes before the last generation of bakers who hold them passes away. The modern pound cake is lighter, leavened, often from a box mix. It is a fundamentally different product. The original required arms that did not quit. That was the whole secret. Here is what most people do not realize about Black Easter food. There were two Easters, Church Easter and Home Easter. Church Easter was the public performance. You showed up in your finest clothes. The choir sang. The sermon connected resurrection to liberation. After the service, the potluck tables held deviled eggs, banana pudding, potato salad, pound cake, made by the best cooks in the congregation, and everyone knew who they were. Home Easter was different. Home Easter was the ham curing since November, the oxtails braising since dawn, the greens simmering since the night before, the caramel cake that took 3 attempts to get the icing right. Home Easter was where the real cooking happened, away from the church lady's judgment, where your grandmother could take her time and cook what her grandmother taught her. The potluck fed the community. The home table fed your soul. Both are vanishing. The potluck because churches are shrinking. The home table because families are scattered. 2 Easters, both nearly gone. Number 7, salmon patties and pinto beans, the full plate. A retired school teacher in Memphis served salmon patties and pinto beans together as one plate, a habit she had carried up from the Mississippi Delta in 1962. The patties came from a single can of double Q pink salmon, the beans from a pot she had simmered the day before. She ladled a scoop of beans onto the left side of the plate, set 2 hot patties on the right, and tucked a square of hot water cornbread between them like a small wall, a spoon of pot liquor over the beans, a glass of buttermilk on the side. The plate ran her about $1.20 in 1985. She ate it watching the 6 o'clock news. The patties hissed when she set them on the plate. The beans pooled around the cornbread. The buttermilk went down cold. A senior with 1 can and 1 pot had a plate that did not look like poverty. To you and to her, it looked like dinner. Number 9, cornmeal mush with fatback. This was breakfast in a hurry. A handful of cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until it thickened into a soft porridge. A small piece of fatback sliced thin and crisped in a separate pan. The mush went into a bowl. The fatback went on top. The grease melted into the mush. Children ate it before walking to the cotton row or the rural schoolhouse when the school year ran short between picking seasons in October and April. Cornmeal mush kept a working body fueled until noon dinner. It used the cheapest grain in the South and the cheapest cut of the hog. A woman named Bessie Lee in Mound Bayou cooked this 5 mornings a week for 30 years, from 1922 to 1952. Her grandchildren remembered the smell of fatback hitting hot iron the way other children remembered the sound of a school bell. If you ate her mush as a child, you remember the way it sat warm in your stomach all the way to lunchtime. Molasses popcorn balls. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi made these every October for the children on her street from 1954 until 1978. She popped corn in a heavy pot on the stove, boiled molasses with a little butter and vinegar until it reached the soft ball stage, poured it over the popcorn, and shaped the mixture into balls with her bare hands while it was still warm enough to stick but cool enough not to burn. She greased her palms with butter first. She made between 40 and 60 of them every Halloween and wrapped each one in wax paper twisted at both ends. In those days, homemade treats were what children expected. The popcorn balls were sweet, salty, and sticky in a way that no store-bought candy could match. By the late 1970s, fear of tampered candy ended the tradition of homemade Halloween treats in most neighborhoods, and the popcorn balls disappeared with it. The recipe was not lost. The trust was. Number 10, butter beans. Number 16, scrambling eggs in a cold pan over the lowest possible flame. A Sunday breakfast in 1959 Detroit. the radio playing Mahalia Jackson. Big Mama cracked 4 eggs into a cold cast iron skillet, dropped a tablespoon of butter into the center, and turned the burner to its lowest setting. She stirred the eggs slow with a wooden spoon, never lifting the pan, never raising the heat. 8 minutes later, the eggs came out the color of fresh cream, soft as custard, the curds barely formed. She salted them at the end. She served them on a slice of buttered toast with a side of fried apples. Here's the thing, a French chef in Manhattan would later teach his cooks the same exact technique and charge $34 for the plate. Big Mama charged a kiss on the cheek and a thank you, ma'am. The eggs were better than anything in any restaurant for one simple reason. She cooked them like she meant it. Number 24, fried chicken cooked in lard. Nothing said the preacher was coming to dinner like a skillet of chicken popping in a deep pool of hog lard. For generations, the fat of choice was lard, scooped from a tin and melted down until a drop crumb sizzled and floated. The bird went in dredged and seasoned, and the lard gave that shattering, deep gold crust no vegetable oil could match. When the saturated fat campaigns picked up steam through the 1960s, lard became the villain of the cooking world, and health bulletins pushed families toward the new hydrogenated shortenings and bottled oils instead. Shortening makers leaned hard into that message, running ad after ad that framed lard as old-fashioned and bad for the heart. County nutrition columns echoed the same advice, telling readers to set the lard tin aside and pour from a bottle. Black cooks who had fried in lard since slavery knew the difference on the tongue and resisted the swap, since the new oils gave a paler, greasier crust and none of the deep flavor. Sunday chicken stayed in the lard pot in most kitchens, no matter what the leaflet said, and the platter still came out heaped and golden after church. The warning changed the label on the can, never the skillet on the stove. Number 23, fried bologna sandwiches. And by 1983, when generic store brand bologna sat at under $1 a pound and Oscar Mayer ran closer to $2, Black mothers across the Midwest had perfected the art of frying both. A thick slice went into a hot grease pan with a small slit cut into each side to keep it from puffing up like a balloon. The edges crisp to brown, the middle stayed soft, and the smell filled the kitchen in under a minute. 2 slices of cheap white bread, a smear of French's yellow mustard, a slice of American cheese if payday had hit, and a leaf of iceberg lettuce if you had it. This was the after-school plate for the latchkey kids of Detroit and Cleveland whose mothers worked second shift at the hospital or the post office. The sandwich was assembled in 3 minutes flat and eaten in front of cartoons at 4:30 in the afternoon. A small glass of Kool-Aid washed it down. Fried bologna was the snack that became supper when the paycheck was 3 days late. Number 15, Colt's foot. Like comfrey, this was a plant the old folks kept for the cough that would not quit. They brewed the leaves into a tea or boiled them down into a syrup, and they swore by it through every winter, a remedy carried over from the old country and kept alive in southern kitchens. The name itself promised healing for the chest, but coltsfoot belongs to the same toxic family as comfrey, loaded with the same pyrrolizidine alkaloids that quietly destroy the liver and have been linked to cancer. A tea taken for comfort was scarring an organ with every cup. The FDA flagged it among the dangerous botanicals and pushed it out of dietary supplements, warning the public against the very cure their grandmothers had trusted. A plant kept for generations to soothe a sick child turned out to carry a slow and hidden harm, restricted once the science named what it really did. Number 16, ash cake. Before there were ovens in most rural homes, there was fire. Ash cake was cornmeal dough shaped by hand, wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, and buried directly in the hot ashes of a hearth fire. It baked slowly from all sides. When it was pulled out and the leaves peeled away, the outside was dark and smoky, and the inside was dense and steaming. The method was ancient. Variations of it appear in cooking traditions across West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South. The oldest plantation records mention ash cake as the primary bread of enslaved people before the 1830s. It required no pan, no oven, no fuel beyond the fire already burning for warmth. When cast iron became widely available after the Civil War, ash cake disappeared almost overnight. Number 4, streak-o-lean and grits for 1. Frying a single strip of streak of lean, that mostly fat, lightly streaked pork-side meat, the country folks down in rural Alabama swore by since the sharecropping years, was the start of breakfast or supper for a widow in Selma in 1979. She rendered the strip slowly in a small black skillet over a low flame until it shriveled and crisped at the edges, set it aside on a torn piece of brown paper bag to drain, then poured a half cup of stone ground yellow grits into the hot pork fat along with a cup of boiling water and a generous shake of salt. The grits cooked into a coarse, savory, deeply buttery porridge in 15 minutes of steady stirring. She crumbled the streak of lean on top in small, brittle pieces, dotted the bowl with a teaspoon of fresh butter, and ate it at the kitchen table with a tall glass of cold buttermilk and a slice of light bread on the side. About 15 cents in 1979 money, 2 meals a day for 2 days. That was the whole recipe. Number 14, scrambled eggs stretched with flour. When a dozen eggs cost 57 cents and a household had 6 mouths to feed, you stretched the eggs with flour and nobody complained. 2 eggs got beaten in a bowl with a heaping tablespoon of flour and a splash of water until smooth. That mixture poured into a hot grease pan made enough fluffy curds to feed 3 children. The flour added body, the eggs added flavor, and the pan came out almost as full as if 4 eggs had gone in. Working mothers across the urban South used this trick on Wednesdays and Thursdays when payday was still 2 mornings away. Older folks today remember it as a perfectly normal breakfast and never once thought of it as cutting corners. It was simply how breakfast got made. What we now romanticize as soul food started right here at the kitchen counter with a tablespoon of flour stretching what our mothers had into what the household needed. Number 7, soul food chicken and dumplings. This was the one-pot meal that said everything is going to be all right, even when it was not. A whole chicken boiled until the meat slid off the bones. The bones went back in the broth. Strips of dough made from nothing but flour, water, and a pinch of salt dropped into that broth and cooked until they puffed up and turned soft. The broth was golden and thick with starch from the dumplings. A retired school teacher in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, made chicken and dumplings every Wednesday for 9 years after she lost her husband in 1971. She said it was the only meal that made her feel like she was cooking for someone, even though she ate alone. A whole bird cost 59 cents a pound. The dumplings cost nothing. Flour and water, that was all. But the act of rolling out those dumplings, cutting them into strips, dropping them one by one into a bubbling pot, that was not cooking. That was a woman keeping herself company. Number 9, blackstrap molasses on a split biscuit. This was the breakfast your grandmother's grandmother knew. A woman in Tuskegee, Alabama, would split a hot biscuit in half, lay a smear of butter on each side, then pour a slow circle of blackstrap molasses over the top until the bread turned dark and glossy. Blackstrap molasses was the last boiling of sugar cane juice, the darkest and most bitter of the 3 grades. and it was the cheapest sweetener available to black families in the rural South. A Department of Agriculture study in the 1890s found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the three staple foods in black households around Tuskegee. 60 years later, in the 1950s, that had barely changed. Molasses was still there on the breakfast table. The flavor was strong and earthy, almost medicinal. Children who grew up eating it either loved it or learned to love it because there was nothing else sweet in the house. When refined sugar became cheap, molasses lost its place. But it had carried generations. Smoked catfish. A man in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1956 caught his catfish in the Yazoo River, smoked them over hickory in a barrel rigged behind his shed, and fed his family for a week on what the river gave him. The fish came out of the smoker bronze and glossy, the skin holding tight to the flesh. He hung them in the smokehouse for another night before the family ate. A 3.5-ounce serving of that catfish carried up to 121% of the daily value for vitamin B12, plus 600 milligrams of EPA and DHA, the omega-3 forms a man in his 60s needed to keep his nervous system steady. The 1980s warned against fried fish and lumped catfish in with fast food. What that warning missed is that smoking is not frying. He was eating exactly what a 2024 cardiology paper would have prescribed. He wasn't waiting for the paper. He was waiting for the river. The river kept delivering. Number 18, baked macaroni and cheese. The Easter version was not the stovetop kind. It was a custard-style casserole baked with eggs and evaporated milk until it came out firm enough to slice. Golden brown, crust on top. Every family had a slightly different recipe, and the debate over sharp cheddar versus Velveeta could divide a congregation faster than a new pastor. Here's the part you probably do not know. The man credited with preparing one of the first macaroni and cheese dishes in America was James Hemings, born 1765, enslaved by Thomas Jefferson from birth. Jefferson took him to Paris in the 1780s, where Hemings trained in French cuisine. He brought the recipe back to Virginia. Hemings negotiated his own freedom in 1796. Let that sit with you. One of the very few enslaved chefs to ever do so. He died in 1801 at age 36. A block of sharp cheddar cost 30 cents a pound in the 1940s. It runs $5 to $7 now. An enslaved black man made macaroni and cheese for the president who owned him. Then it became the most beloved dish at free black Easter tables. That tells you everything about who really built this country's food culture. Here is something nobody talks about when they talk about Easter dinner. For black families during Jim Crow, Easter Sunday was the one day you ate like royalty in your own home. The rest of the year, segregation told you where to eat, where to sit, which water fountain to drink from. But on Easter Sunday, inside those walls, none of that existed. The table was set with the best china. Children wore brand new outfits. The food had to be immaculate, not because anyone was coming to inspect it, because dignity required it. After the Great Migration, when over 7 million black Americans left the South between 1915 and 1970, Easter dinner became proof that home still existed. A family in Bronzeville or Harlem would set a table that looked exactly like the one back in Mississippi. Same ham, same greens, same cake, recipes carried in memory across 1,000 miles. Easter dinner was not about showing off. It was about refusing to be diminished. Number 13, fried green tomatoes at the end of summer. The last green tomatoes hung on the vines in late September, too cold to ripen, too good to waste. A grandmother in Birmingham picked them, sliced them a 1/4 inch thick, salted them, and let them sweat on a paper towel for 10 minutes. She dredged each slice in seasoned cornmeal and pan-fried them in bacon grease until the cornmeal went bronze and the inside went tender. 3 minutes aside, she ate 6 slices with a piece of Wonder Bread and a glass of buttermilk. Free if she grew them. 20 cents a pound at the curb market if she did not. If you ever stood at the screen door waiting for the smell, you know this kind of supper was the cheapest kind of joy. The garden told her what supper was. The skillet did the rest. Number 2, pickled pig feet from the country store jar. By 1938, the country stores across the Delta carried glass jars of pickled pig feet on the back shelf, sold for a nickel each. They came in a brine of vinegar, salt, and a few red peppers. A sharecropper walking home from the field on a Saturday evening might trade a few coppers for one. He ate it on the porch, slow, with a piece of cold cornbread, while the sun went down over the cotton. The vinegar bit. The pork was soft and gelatinous. The bones, picked clean, went to the yard dog. Pickled pig feet were the small reward at the end of a long week. They were the meal a grown man ate alone with his hat off and his work shirt unbuttoned while the cicadas started up in the trees. They were proof that a hard day could end with something almost like dinner. He earned that 1 nickel and chose this. That choice was its own kind of freedom. Number 22, boiled peanuts. Back in those days, if you drove through rural Georgia, Alabama, or South Carolina in late summer, you would see hand-painted signs on the side of the road that said nothing but 2 words, boiled peanuts. A woman in Americus, Georgia, made hers in a dented stock pot on a propane burner set up in her front yard. She used green peanuts straight from the field, still caked in red Georgia clay, and boiled them in salt water for 4 hours until the shells turned soft and the peanuts inside were tender like a cooked bean. A brown paper sack of them cost $0.25 in 1966. The practice of boiling peanuts has roots that stretch back to West African cooking traditions, where legumes were boiled and seasoned as a common preparation. By the time the peanut became a major Southern crop after the Civil War, Black families had already been boiling them for generations. That roadside sack was not a snack, it was a history lesson you could hold in your hand. Number 23, rendering pork fat on a Sunday and pouring it into a coffee can for the rest of the week. A wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, 1953. Your big mama cut 3 pounds of fat back into half-inch cubes, dropped them into a heavy pot with a 1/4 cup of water, and let the whole thing simmer over a low flame for 2 hours. The water cooked off, the fat melted out clear as honey. The crackling sank to the bottom, golden and crisp, ready to be salted and snacked on by any grandchild who wandered through. The clear lard went through a square of cheesecloth into a Maxwell house can on the back of the stove. That can fed her family every supper for a week, and the next and the next. The thing is, modern science didn't walk back its warnings on lard until around 2010. By then, she'd been cooking with it for 60 years and had never seen the inside of a cardiologist's office. Number 23, crackling cornbread. This was cornbread with the gift of the hog baked right into it. Cracklings are the crisp little bits of pork skin and fat left over after rendering lard, salty and crunchy, and folding a handful into the cornmeal batter turned plain bread into something a family fought over. It was thrift-made delicious, every scrap of the pig used, nothing wasted, a habit carried straight out of slave quarter kitchens where the offcuts were all anybody got. Then came the 1960s and the rising concern over saturated fat in the new heart studies, and cracklings were exactly the kind of pork fat indulgence the new guidance frowned on. After the American Heart Association issued its first warning on saturated fat, public health writers of the era began naming lard-rich breads among the foods to cut back on for the sake of the heart. Some county leaflets even printed cornbread recipes stripped of the cracklings. But crackling cornbread was a holiday on a plate, the crunch of the pork skin against the soft crumb, and nobody was giving that up over a pamphlet. It went on getting baked in the same black skillet and carried hot to the table. The officials counted the grease while the family counted the slices. Number 20, red beans and rice. Pour the dry red beans into a heavy pot Monday night, cover them in cold water, and soak them through until morning, and you had the foundation of Tuesday supper in every Louisiana black household. Tuesday was wash day, and red beans needed almost no watching while sheets and work shirts hung on the line out back. A smoked turkey neck, a cut-up yellow onion, 2 cloves of garlic, a bay leaf, a shake of Tony Chachere's, and fresh water to cover. The pot simmered low for 4 hours while everything else got done around the house. The beans broke down into their own thick gravy, served over hot white rice with a square of cornbread on the side and a splash of vinegar pepper sauce on top. It fed 5 working people for under $2.50 in $1984. Red beans were the Tuesday tradition that crossed state lines through the Great Migration. Number 23, sea turtle meat. Along the Gullah Geechee coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, turtle was once a Sunday food, stewed slow with onions, sherry, and dark roux into a soup that fed whole families. Green sea turtle was the prize, rich and almost beefy, and the recipes for it passed down through low country kitchens for generations. Coastal black communities had cooked it since slavery, turning a creature that washed up in the marsh into something worth gathering around. But the great sea turtles were vanishing, hunted toward the edge of extinction up and down both coasts. So Congress acted. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 made it illegal to take, sell, or serve any of the 6 sea turtle species in American waters, and turtle soup left the menu. Restaurants that had served it for 100 years quietly dropped it. A dish older than the recipes that named it was ended not by taste but by law. 22, leather breeches. Every fall across Appalachia and the Upper South, green beans were threaded onto long strings with a needle and hung from porch rafters or kitchen ceiling beams to dry in the air. They hung there for weeks, shriveling into tough, leathery strips that looked like nothing you would want to eat. The cookbooks called them leather breeches. When winter came, the dried beans were pulled down, soaked overnight, and simmered low with a ham hock or a piece of smoked side meat. After hours in the pot, they softened into something rich and deep with a concentrated flavor that fresh green beans could never match. The method came through the Caribbean and into the American South. Dehydration was preservation before refrigeration existed. The strings came down for good when chest freezers arrived. Number 23, salt pork and turnip greens, single pot. Frying off a 2-inch chunk of salt pork until the edges curled and the fat ran clear was how every greens dinner started in a small kitchen in Itta, Mississippi in 1976. The greens, washed 3 times in the sink because grit hides under that ribbon of leaf, went in next, still wet from rinsing. They hit the hot pork fat and steamed themselves down to 1/4 of their original size. A senior cooking for one used half a bunch, never the whole. She would add a splash of cane vinegar at the end and let the whole thing cook covered for 40 minutes until the greens were silky and the pot liquor at the bottom turned black-green. 1 bowl that night, the 2nd bowl over rice tomorrow, the pork chunks sliced thin for a sandwich on day 3. The greens fed her 3 meals, and her blood pressure thanked her by Thursday. That was enough. Number 22, sunrise skillet grits with pan drippings. The Sunrise Kitchen in a 1960s soul food household ran on one rhythm, and grits with pan drippings was its first sound. Water went into the heavy pot before anyone else was awake. Once it rolled, a slow handful of stone, ground white grits got stirred in with a long wooden spoon, and the pot sat at the back of the stove for almost an hour. Right before plating, a tablespoon of bacon drippings from the coffee can on the counter went straight into the bowl. That spoonful turned a plain breakfast into something that tasted like the meat from the night before without costing 1 extra cent. The bowl came to the table with the rim of the spoon already buried, and most people did not look up until the bowl was clean. That spoonful of saved drippings is what we still call the soul of soul food, one quiet ingredient carrying the memory of every meal that came before it. Number 24, tripe and hominy stew. Most people today wouldn't touch tripe, but for Black seniors who grew up in the rural South, tripe was a gift. A pound of honeycomb tripe cost 29 cents in 1972. A can of hominy cost a dime. You cleaned the tripe, cut it into strips, and simmered it with the hominy, onions, garlic, a bay leaf, and water. 4 hours turned the tripe tender and rich. The hominy swelled into a stew that stuck to your bones and didn't ask for anything else beside it. A retired hog farmer outside Macon, Georgia, ate this every Saturday for 9 years after his wife passed. He made it the way she taught him. He said the smell of it simmering was the closest thing he had to her being in the room. Nobody wrote it in a cookbook. It kept a man fed and whole when the house felt too empty to bear. Number 24, sweet potato and leftover pork. In Tuskegee, Alabama, in the 1950s, a study by the Department of Agriculture found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the staple foods in most Black households. So when there was a piece of pork left from supper, it did not get thrown away. A woman in rural Alabama would slice a cold sweet potato from the night before, fry it in the leftover pork grease alongside whatever scrap of meat remained, and serve it with a biscuit. That was breakfast. Sweet potatoes were everywhere in the South. They grew in the small plots that Black families kept behind their houses, the same way their ancestors had grown them for generations. The potato was free, the pork was already cooked, the grease was already in the pan. This was not leftovers, this was planning. And it was the kind of breakfast that disappeared when refrigerators got bigger and people started throwing food away. That used to be unthinkable. Number 16, kale with smoked turkey. A church kitchen in Atlanta in 1962 poured broth over a pile of curly leaves and let them simmer with smoked turkey wings until the fat dissolved into the pot. The greens went onto a long folding table beside cornbread and sweet tea. The supper started at 6. The dishes were washed by 9. Everybody went home full. Kale is a brassica, the same family as broccoli, and the slow simmer makes its iron available in a way a raw salad cannot. For decades, white restaurants put kale beside fish as garnish food. Black church suppers cooked it as a meal. The 2010 wellness boom acted like kale was a discovery. It was not. The supper at the church in Atlanta in 1962 had been serving it for years, with smoked turkey, with cornbread on the side, with iced tea sweet enough to make your teeth hurt. Nothing about that supper has been improved by the wellness industry. The branding has been improved. The food is the same. Number 14, banana pudding. The Easter banana pudding that has disappeared is the from scratch version. Real egg custard cooked on the stovetop, layered with fresh bananas and vanilla wafers, topped with meringue brown golden in the oven. Making it took 90 minutes. The instant pudding mixed with Cool Whip version takes 15, an 83% reduction in labor that changed the dish forever. At every Black church Easter potluck, banana pudding arrived in the same Pyrex dish that had served 3 generations. You knew whose was whose, because in a community where everything was shared, that recipe was the one secret nobody gave up. The real custard version required skill, cooking the eggs to exactly the right temperature without scrambling them, achieving the right thickness, timing the meringue, 6 to 8 eggs for the custard and meringue, 1 quart of whole milk, about 6 bananas. The dish came to church in the morning. It sat on a table with 20 other dishes from 20 other women, and you knew exactly which one to reach for first. The instant version killed the skill, but it also killed your pride in making it. Here's something that does not get said enough. These recipes did not just survive the South, they survived a journey. Between 1915 and 1970, over 7 million Black Americans left the rural South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They packed what they could carry: clothes, photographs, and recipes, mostly unwritten, held entirely in the memory of the women who made them. Your grandmother in Mississippi, who braised oxtails for 6 hours, did not write that down. Her daughter watched. Her granddaughter watched the daughter. The recipe traveled from Greenwood to Chicago in a suitcase that held no paper. When that family set an Easter table in Bronzeville, the food was identical to what they had left behind. Same ham hock in the greens, same cornbread in the same cast iron skillet, same caramel cake with the icing beaten by hand. That was the point. The table was the last piece of home that could not be taken. But each generation that passed without writing those recipes down lost a little more, and now your family is running out of grandmothers who remember. Number 9, smothered turkey wings with rice. A pack of 3 turkey wings at the corner store in Cleveland ran $2 in 1985, more than chicken parts, less than pork chops. A grandmother seasoned the wings hard with Lawry's, garlic powder, and black pepper, dredged them in seasoned flour, and browned them in a deep iron skillet for 10 minutes aside. She lifted them out, sweated 2 yellow onions and a chopped bell pepper in the drippings, stirred in 4 spoons of flour, and poured in 3 cups of water and a splash of kitchen bouquet. The gravy thickened to the color of strong tea. She nestled the wings back in, covered the pan, and let it simmer an hour and 20 minutes until the meat slid off the bone. Her kitchen filled with the smell of brown gravy in slow time. She served the wings over a scoop of Uncle Ben's. Rice with a side of canned green beans, warm with a knob of margarine. 3 wings, 2 suppers, 1 pot. The seniors who learned to brown a piece of meat properly never went hungry. Your grandmother went on cooking long after the world stopped expecting her to. Number 17, smothered squirrel with brown gravy. Boys as young as 9 carried single-shot rifles into the river bottom on Saturday mornings to bring home meat. A pair of squirrels was a good day. Their mother would skin them, joint them, dredge the pieces in flour, and brown them in bacon grease. Then she added water, more flour, and a little salt and let the gravy thicken slow over a low fire. The squirrel meat turned tender. The gravy went the color of dark earth. She poured the whole pot over rice or cornbread or whatever. Starch was on the shelf. Smothered squirrel was the dinner that turned a boy's marksmanship into a family's protein. Across Bolivar County in 1936, hunting for the pot was not a hobby. It was the difference between a child going to bed full and a child waking up hungry. The forests of the Mississippi Delta had been hunted clean for 2 centuries by the time the Great Depression came. By the 1930s, a single squirrel was a small miracle. A woman named Lula in Mound Bayou kept the pelts and tanned them for winter mittens. Nothing was thrown out. Not the bones, not the fur, not the broth. Imagine your own kitchen tonight, throwing nothing away for 30 years straight. That was the genius of sharecropping cooking. A 2-pound animal fed a family of 7 and clothed 2 children's hands for a whole winter. The rifle moved from father to son. The cook saved the bones for soup the next day. This was not cuisine, this was engineering. Cracklings. These were not the same as pork rinds, and that difference mattered. A crackling was the skin of the hog with the fat still attached, fried until the outside shattered and the inside stayed rich and chewy. Pork rinds were just the skin, puffed up like a chip. A woman in Opelousas, Louisiana, fried her cracklings in a cast iron Dutch oven the morning after hog killing day and laid them out on brown paper to drain. In 1967, a pound of fresh cracklings at the butcher counter cost about 20 cents. You ate them plain, standing in the yard, or you crumbled them into cornbread batter for crackling bread. The difference between a crackling and a pork rind is the difference between a memory and a photograph of a memory. One has depth, the other is flat. The bagged pork rinds survived. The fresh cracklings did not. Number 11. Number 19. The cornmeal dredge, done twice with a 5-minute rest between coats. A Tuesday supper in 1961 Atlanta, the kitchen window opened to a thunderstorm rolling off Stone Mountain. Big Mama had 3 plates set out on the counter. The first held buttermilk, thick and tangy, a splash of hot sauce stirred in. The second held seasoned flour, salt, pepper, garlic powder, and a heavy pinch of paprika. The third held white cornmeal mixed with the same seasonings. She dipped each piece of catfish into the buttermilk, then rolled it through the flour, then back into the buttermilk a second time, then into the cornmeal. She set every dredged fillet on a wire rack over a plate and walked away for exactly 5 minutes. The first coat hydrated, the second coat dried into the first. By the time the lard hit 365 degrees in the iron skillet, the crust was already half locked on. She fried each fillet 2 minutes aside. The crust came out shattering crisp, golden as a Carolina sunset, sealed so tight that not a drop of oil reached the white flesh underneath. She learned the trick from a fish fry on the Pearl River when she was 11 years old. The man running the fryer was an oysterman from Biloxi who'd been frying mullet for 40 years. He told her the rest is the recipe. The buttermilk and the meal are just paint. The rest is what holds the picture together. The part few people talk about is that Big Mama passed it on to her 3 daughters and 7 granddaughters, one by one, every Friday night. One of them is still doing it in a kitchen in Charlotte, and her grandchildren can't eat fast food fish without saying it tastes like soggy cardboard. The trick is older than the supermarket. It's older than the deep fryer. It's as old as a black grandmother who refused to serve her family anything less than glass. Number 16, chitterlings, the dish that set off a real public sanitation alert. Chitterlings, or chitlins, are the small intestines of the hog, and cleaning them is the hardest, slowest, most exacting job in soul food cooking. Every length has to be turned, scraped, and rinsed again and again before it ever simmers, and that long, raw handling is exactly what worried the health authorities. The bacteria of concern is Yersinia, which lives in the hog's gut, and public health studies later trace cases of illness in young children to kitchens where raw chitlins were cleaned. The germs spread to counters, bottles, and pacifiers. Georgia public health researchers eventually found that boiling the chitlins for 5 minutes before cleaning killed the bacteria without changing the flavor. But in the 1960s, the warnings landed loud, and some cities pressed families to handle them with care or leave them be. The kitchens kept the New Year's pot going regardless. The alert named the danger, the tradition named the day. Number 16, black-eyed peas and rice. The pot of black-eyed peas was the dish that carried a year of luck and a week of meals in the same heavy lid. A pound bag of dry peas cost 40 cents at the corner grocery in 1987. A single smoked turkey wing cost $1, and the two of them simmered together for 2 hours with onion and garlic until they tasted older than the kitchen they were cooked in. The broth turned brown and smoky and clung to every grain of long grain rice underneath. Served over hot white rice with a splash of vinegar hot sauce and a side of chopped raw onion, it was the cheapest, complete protein supper a black working household could put together in the late 1980s. Hoppin' John was the Carolina name for it, but Detroit and Chicago grandmothers cooked the exact same pot and just called it Wednesday. Black-eyed peas were luck you could eat with a spoon. Number 21, comfrey. In old Southern home medicine, this broad-leafed plant was a fixture, brewed into a bitter tea for coughs and stomach trouble, and laid as a poultice on sprains and broken skin. Country healers and grandmothers kept it growing by the back door, and its leaves sometimes found their way into the greens pot the way any wild green might. People trusted it because their mothers had trusted it. But comfrey carries pyrrolizidine alkaloids, compounds that quietly scar the liver and have been tied to cancer in study after study. The damage builds slow with no warning until it is far along. On July 6, 2001, the FDA acted to pull comfrey from every dietary supplement sold in the country, ending its long run as a kitchen cure. A remedy that had been handed down as wisdom for generations turned out to be poisoning the very organ it was meant to heal. Number 20, Kush. Most people have never heard the word. Kush was yesterday's cornbread, crumbled into a skillet with a little bacon grease and fried until crispy on the outside. Some cookbooks added milk or buttermilk to the pan, turning it into a thick porridge. Others folded in diced onion. The Gullah Geechee version along the coast of South Carolina used crumbled cornbread with cane syrup and butter. Every version started with the same idea. Leftover cornbread was not waste. It was breakfast. In households where bread was baked every day and nothing was thrown out, Kush was the Monday morning answer to Sunday's extra pan. The name may trace back to couscous, carried from West Africa and adapted with the grains available here. By the 1970s, when sliced white bread and boxed cereal took over the morning table, Kush lost its reason to exist. Every recipe so far shares something in common. They required no trip to a store, no brand name, no packaging. Cracklings came from the hog you raised. Tomatoes came from the garden you kept. Poke grew in the ditch beside the road. Cornbread left over from last night became tomorrow's breakfast without anyone calling it a recipe. The entire system was built on what was already there, and that is exactly why the modern food industry had no use for it. You cannot sell a woman what she already grows, kills, preserves, and cooks from memory. The only way to replace her food was to make her children forget she ever knew how to make it. This is where the story reaches further back than the country itself. Number 21, stewed tomatoes over white rice. She would crack open a can of whole tomatoes for 29 cents at the corner store in North Nashville and pour them into a small saucepan with a knob of bacon grease, a chopped onion, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. 20 minutes on a low burner broke the tomatoes down into a thick, sweet, salty sauce that filled the apartment with a smell most people associated with their mothers. She ladled it over a half cup of long grain rice that she had cooked plain in the same pot earlier. The whole supper cost about 35 cents in 1982 and took less than half an hour from start to fork. A retired hotel cook in Nashville used to say the tomato gravy was the difference between eating and being fed. One can of tomatoes carried her 2 suppers and a breakfast. This was not cuisine, this was engineering. Number 18, Streako lean and red-eye gravy. Few breakfasts spoke louder about Black Southern survival than a thin slice of Streako lean with a pour of red-eye gravy on top. Streako lean was the cheap cousin of bacon, a piece of side meat with stripes of pink running through the fat. It cost half what bacon cost in 1965, sometimes only 15 cents a pound at a country store. 2 slices went into a hot pan and curled up tight as they crisped, leaving a thin layer of brown drippings stuck to the bottom. A half cup of strong black coffee poured straight into that hot pan, and the brown bits lifted off the iron in seconds. That dark, salty pour was the red-eye gravy. It went over a split biscuit or a wedge of cornbread, and the streak of lean sat right on top. The flavor was bigger than the price, and most older folks today still remember the smell of coffee hitting that pan first thing in the morning. For many of us, that one pour of red-eye gravy is the closest thing our grandmothers ever left behind to a written recipe. Number 22, butter bean succotash pot. Butter beans were the quiet backbone of Black Southern cooking. They were cheap. They kept for months dried, and they turned creamy when you cooked them low and slow. A senior would soak a cup of dried butter beans overnight, then simmer them the next day with corn cut off the cob, a piece of salt pork, onions, and a little water. 2 hours later, the beans had broken down into a thick, starchy stew that did not need a single other dish beside it. In the 1950s, a bag of dried butter beans cost 15 cents and fed a person for a week. The salt pork was often left over from another meal already paid for. A retired seamstress in Natchez, Mississippi, ate butterbean succotash 4 nights a week for 7 years. She grew the beans herself in a garden behind her house until her knees gave out in 1978. After that, she bought them dried from the corner store and never complained about the difference. The meal didn't change. Her body did. The pot didn't care. Number 14, canned mackerel and eggs. This was the breakfast that cost 19 cents and fed a whole family. A woman in Savannah, Georgia, would open a can of mackerel, drain it, flake it with a fork, and scramble it into eggs with diced onion and black pepper. She fried the mixture in a skillet and served it on a plate with grits or a biscuit on the side. Canned mackerel was even cheaper than canned salmon in the 1950s. It had a stronger flavor, a fishier bite, but mixed into eggs, it mellowed out into something savory and filling. The can sat on the shelf for months. It required no refrigeration. It was protein that waited for you. This was a breakfast for the first of the month and the last of the month, and every morning in between when the icebox was bare. Your grandmother did not choose canned fish because she liked it better than fresh. She chose it because it was always there. Buttermilk pound cake, a loaf pan on a kitchen counter in Atlanta in 1962. The cake just out of the oven, the kitchen smelling of vanilla and butter and caramelized sugar. A woman who hadn't measured a thing. Real butter, fresh eggs, cultured buttermilk, sugar, flour, a slow bake at 325. The buttermilk was fermented dairy with live cultures that supported her gut the same way kefir does. The eggs carried choline. The butter carried fat-soluble vitamins. Every Sunday after church, she sliced the cake with a serrated knife and laid the pieces on a chipped white plate. The cake fell out of favor in the 1990s when fat-free baking mixes filled the supermarket aisle. By 2018, those mixes were quietly losing shelf space because shoppers had finally learned to read the ingredient labels. Her cake on her Sunday table in 1962 was simpler, cheaper, and more honest than any factory dessert sold today. She wrote no book. She wrote a recipe card. She tucked it inside a tin recipe box on the kitchen shelf. If you ever find that recipe box on your mother's shelf, Hold on to it. Number 5, ambrosia salad. The original ambrosia bore no resemblance to the Cool Whip and marshmallow concoction that replaced it. The first recorded recipe appeared in 1867, 3 ingredients only: fresh orange sections, freshly grated coconut, sugar. That was it, named after the food of the Greek gods because it was supposed to taste celestial. In your grandmother's house, ambrosia was reserved for Easter and Christmas only. Preparing it was labor-intensive. Hand grating, coconut, carefully sectioning oranges, served in the best crystal bowl your family owned. A single whole coconut cost 10 to 15 cents in the 1880s, about $3 to $4 today. A proper serving bowl required 2 to 3 fresh oranges and 1 whole coconut. By the 1920s, canned pineapple became widely available. Then came canned mandarin oranges, maraschino cherries, miniature marshmallows. By the 1980s, the original version was essentially extinct. Maria Massey Barringer of North Carolina published that first recipe, though enslaved cooks almost certainly made versions before anyone thought to write it down. Something sacred was replaced by something convenient. You kept the name, you lost the meaning. Number 20, fried okra and potatoes. In the deep South, okra grew in every backyard garden from June through October. You sliced it thin, diced the potato, and fried them together in cast iron with bacon grease until the okra turned crisp and the potatoes turned golden. A dusting of cornmeal kept the okra from getting slimy. That was it. The roots of okra traced directly to West Africa, where the plant had been cultivated for centuries before it crossed the Atlantic. For a senior with a garden, this meal was free. A pound of okra cost 49 cents in 1986 at the store. The bacon grease was saved from breakfast, sitting in the coffee can beside the stove. A retired nurse in Montgomery made fried okra and potatoes every Tuesday from May through September for 15 years. She said, "Summer had a taste. This was it." Number 6, pig ear sandwiches between 2 slices of light bread. The pig ear was tough, gristly, and almost free at the country store, where the cuts white folks would not buy went for pennies on the back shelf. A sharecropper's wife boiled the ears for 3 hours with onion, salt, and a splash of vinegar. They came out tender, smoky, and dark. She sliced them thin and stacked them between 2 slices of soft white bread, sometimes with a smear of mustard if a jar was on the shelf. Pig ear sandwiches were the lunch a working man carried in his overalls pocket out to the field at dawn. They were the meal a mother packed for a son who walked 5 miles to the schoolhouse in 1935. Cheap, filling, honest. Across Sunflower County, the pig ear sandwich was the lunch that built whole families. Your great uncle ate one every workday for 40 years and never once complained. Number 20, fried hand pies. These were half-moon pastries filled with whatever fruit was in season, sealed with a fork and fried in a skillet of hot oil until the crust blistered golden. A woman in Natchez, Mississippi, made hers with dried peaches she had put up the summer before. She soaked the peaches overnight, cooked them down with sugar and cinnamon, and spooned the filling onto circles of dough she rolled thin as a dime. In her kitchen in 1961, those pies cost nothing but time and a cup of lard. Some women used apples, others used blackberries or sweet potato filling. The pies were portable, which made them perfect for field workers, church picnics, and children who needed something to hold them between meals. You could wrap one in a napkin and carry it in your pocket. That was the whole point. By the time frozen turnovers showed up in grocery stores in the 1970s, the handmade version started to vanish. The convenience was cheaper, but it was not the same. Number 14, the long burn on a single onion for the base of every gravy and pot of beans. A Wednesday evening in 1955 Birmingham, Big Mama set a heavy bottom pot over a low flame, dropped in 2 tablespoons of bacon grease, and added 1 yellow onion sliced thin from root to tip. She didn't touch it for 8 minutes. Then she stirred it once and walked away again. She came back 10 minutes later. She stirred it once more. The onions slowly turned from white to gold, then from gold to amber, then from amber to a deep mahogany, the color of a wet log on a forest floor. The whole process took 45 minutes. She used the time to peel potatoes, snap green beans, and pull a pan of cornbread out of the oven. By the time the onions were done, the bottom of the pot was glazed with a brown crust she called the soul of the dish. She poured in a quart of chicken stock and scraped every speck of that crust into the liquid. The stock turned the color of strong tea. She added 2 cups of soaked beans, a smoked ham hock, and a pinch of cayenne. The pot simmered for 2 hours. The result was a bowl of beans so deep in flavor that no amount of seasoning packets could ever touch it. Edna Lewis wrote about this same technique in 1988, 20 years after Big Mama had been doing it without writing it down. The French call it caramelizing. Big Mama called it letting the onion tell you when it's ready. One thing I noticed reading her notebooks is that the trick was never about the onion. It was about the willingness to stand at a stove and wait. A grandmother who wouldn't rush a single onion would never serve her family a thin pot of beans, and her granddaughters could taste the difference between a pot built on patience and a pot built on a packet of mix from the grocery shelf. Generation after generation, the trick traveled. The time stayed the same. Number 21, hog maws. Few dishes test a cook's patience and a kitchen's cleanliness like the stomach of a hog. Hog maws are exactly that. The pig's stomach lining scraped and turned and scrubbed for hours before they ever hit the pot, often simmered right alongside chitterlings for a New Year's feast. They came down the same road as every other offcut handed to enslaved people because the owners would not eat them, then made into something prized through sheer skill. Because the cleaning was so long and so messy, public health officers grouped maws with the other raw pork innards that drove their 1960s urban sanitation drives, warning that careless handling could spread illness around the kitchen. Inspectors leaned on markets and home cooks alike to be cautious with raw hog parts and to scrub down every surface afterward. None of that kept the maws out of the holiday pot, where they simmered soft and savory beside the chitlins for hours. What the city called a hazard, the family called tradition. Number 25, smothered neck bones. The neck bone was the cheapest pork on the meat counter in 1982, and Black grandmothers knew it better than the butcher behind the case did. A pound went for under $1 in most southern grocery stores, and one 3-pound package fed a household of 6 on a Sunday if you stretched it right. The bones went into a heavy pot with chopped onion, garlic powder, a splash of cider vinegar, a bay leaf, and water enough to cover by an inch. 2 hours of low simmering pulled the marrow into the gravy, and the meat slid off the bone with the gentle pull of a fork. Working mothers in Detroit and Atlanta put this pot on before church on Sunday morning and came home at noon to dinner already made and waiting. A scoop of long-grain white rice underneath caught the gravy, and a slice of soft white bread mopped the plate clean at the end. The neck bone was poor man's meat with rich man's flavor. Number 25, tonka bean. Long before vanilla got cheap, cooks reached for tonka bean and the coumarin inside it to flavor custards, puddings, and the imitation vanilla that sweetened many a Sunday cake. It carried a warm scent, somewhere between vanilla and almond and fresh-cut hay, and a few drops went a long way in a poor kitchen. It turned up in cheap flavoring extracts sold right off the grocery shelf. a way for our grandmothers to stretch a little sweetness across a big family. Then the science turned. Researchers tied coumarin to liver damage in animals, and in 1954, the Food and Drug Administration banned it outright as a food additive. The extracts vanished, and the small brown bottles that once sat beside the sugar were quietly pulled from the shelves. Most cooks never knew the name of the thing they had been stirring in. Tonka bean was one of the first flavors Washington decided our kitchens could no longer keep. Number 24, tomato gravy. Across rural Alabama, the Carolinas, and most of Mississippi, breakfast meant biscuits, and biscuits meant gravy. But the gravy in the oldest church cookbooks was not the white sausage gravy sold in cans today. It was tomato gravy, bacon drippings, a spoon of flour, and home canned tomatoes from the summer garden, cooked thick and tangy in a skillet, then poured over split biscuits still warm from the oven. The color was dark red, almost brick. It stained the plate. Families who put up their own tomatoes ate this 4 mornings a week from August through March because the jars held in the pantry without refrigeration. Children who grew up eating it can still describe the exact color. When instant gravy powder arrived in the 1960s, tomato gravy quietly disappeared from most Southern tables before going any further. For those who want more of these old recipes, the dishes covered on this channel, and many that have not been, all collected in one place, Big Mama's Soul Food Kitchen, at my website, thehungryhistorian.com. It will not come up again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, number 10, chicken feet soup. In a small kitchenette on the south side of Chicago in 1980, a Mississippi-born grandmother cooked a Sunday pot of chicken feet soup the way her own grandmother had taught her on a farm outside Yazoo City 60 years before. 8 chicken feet from the butcher cost $1 at the corner shop. She blanched them in boiling water for 2 minutes, peeled the tough yellow skin off the toes, clipped the nails with kitchen shears, then simmered them low and slow for 2 hours with a couple of carrots, 2 stalks of celery with leaves, 3 cloves of garlic, and at the end a small handful of broken egg noodles. The feet released a thick golden broth heavy with collagen, the kind no store-bought stock could match. Older women in the neighborhood swore by it for stiff knees and a good night of sleep. She would skim the fat into a saved coffee can, season the pot with salt and white pepper, and eat 1 bowl every night for 4 nights until the pot was empty. $1 in her time, that was the whole recipe. Number 24, 1 slab of fatback, 7 mornings. A single piece of fatback could feed a whole household for a week, and grandmothers in Mississippi and Alabama knew exactly how to make it last. They would buy 1 thick slab on Saturday for around 20 cents a pound, then score it across the top with a paring knife so the salt would render down slow. Monday morning, 2 slices went into the cold skillet. Those slices crisped up and gave back nearly a cup of clear, golden grease that flavored everything else that hit the pan that week. The skillet never got washed. The leftover grease became the cooking fat for Tuesday's eggs, Wednesday's grits, Thursday's potatoes, and Friday's hoe cakes. By Sunday, the original slab was almost gone, but the flavor had touched every plate that came through the kitchen. 1 pig and a careful hand could carry a family from one paycheck to the next, and almost no one threw away the brown bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. Number 23, Brunswick stew. This was the meal that fed entire churches on a Sunday afternoon. The original came out of Virginia in the 1820s, and by the time it reached Black communities across the Deep South, it had become something different, something better. A senior would take whatever meat was on sale, usually chicken thighs at 39 cents a pound, and drop them in a pot with canned tomatoes, corn, lima beans, potatoes, and a splash of vinegar. 2 hours of simmering and the chicken fell apart into a thick, smoky broth. One batch made enough for 4 days. A woman named Lucille Harper in Savannah, Georgia, made Brunswick stew every other week for 14 years after her husband died in 1969. She never measured a thing. She said your hands know what a pot needs if you've been cooking long enough. The truth is, it belonged to whoever needed a cheap meal that tasted like someone loved them. Number 17, rice and gravy. In parts of Louisiana, South Carolina, and coastal Georgia, rice was not a side dish. It was the center of the plate. A woman in Beaufort, South Carolina, would cook a pot of white rice in the morning, ladle leftover gravy from the night before over the top, and call it breakfast. That was it. Rice and gravy, no egg, no meat, just starch and salt and whatever flavor the gravy carried from supper. The connection between black families and rice runs deep. Enslaved Africans from the rice-growing regions of West Africa were specifically brought to South Carolina because they knew how to cultivate the crop. That knowledge built the entire low country economy, and generations later, their descendants were still eating rice every single morning. The gravy might be beef drippings, it might be onion gravy, it might be nothing more than flour and water browned in a skillet. The rice held it all. That was the whole point. Number 25, lard fried chicken. A cast iron skillet on a wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, holding 3 inches of pork fat the grandmother had rendered herself from a shoulder trim that morning. She strained it through cheesecloth into a tin she kept behind the stove, the same tin her own mother had used. The thighs went in skin down, sizzling so loud she could not hear the radio. She fried them slow, never rushed, until the skin shattered like glass when you bit into it. The kitchen smelled like sizzle and smoke and Sunday afternoon. On Sundays after church, the family ate it standing in the kitchen because there were not enough chairs and nobody minded. Then, in 1977, a Senate report told her to stop. Lard was the new enemy. Switch to soybean oil, cottonseed oil, anything but the fat that had fed her people through 2 world wars. She didn't switch. By the time researchers in 2010 admitted lard had no real link to heart disease, she had been gone 12 years. Her recipe was already in her granddaughter's hand. Number 22, deviled eggs with paprika. Every black woman at Easter had her deviled egg plate, not just any plate, a special carrier with little indentations for each egg half. She carried it to church like a crown, because on Easter Sunday, your eggs were judged. The differences were subtle but deadly serious. Ratio of mustard to mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, or dill, how much paprika went on top. The first known deviled egg recipe appeared in 1877 in the Montgomery Advertiser in Alabama. By the mid-20th century, a dozen eggs cost about 60 cents. Those vintage egg plates from the 1950s and 1960s now sell for $25 to $75 on collector markets. The dish had a practical origin too. After weeks of Lent, your family had accumulated hard-boiled Easter eggs that needed eating. But the real reason deviled eggs mattered was simpler than that. They were one of the few pieces of fancy serving ware that working class black women owned. Presentation was everything. Adrian Miller, the James Beard Award-winning soul food historian, has called deviled eggs one of the clearest shared traditions across the Southern racial divide, a rare point of commonality. That small truth mattered. Number 22, tuna and rice casserole. A retired bus driver in Cleveland kept his pantry to 7 items by the middle of the month: 2 cans of chicken of the sea, a box of minute rice, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom, a sleeve of saltines, evaporated milk, an onion, and a brick of government cheese. He chopped the onion, browned it in margarine, stirred in the rice, the soup, the milk, and a splash of water, then folded in the drained tuna and a handful of crumbled saltines. He grated the government cheese over the top and baked it covered for 30 minutes. The casserole came out hot and binding and quiet. It fed him for 3 nights. The pan went into the sink and stayed there until morning. If you ever lived alone, you know that the dishes wait. He had stopped washing them after dark when he stopped having a wife to tell about his day. Number 18, possum stewed with sweet potatoes. Possum hunting was a winter tradition across the Delta for decades, from November through February. Men would walk the woods after the first frost with a coon dog and a kerosene lantern. The meat was greasy and gamey and needed a long simmer with sweet potatoes to soften the flavor. A sharecropper's wife would parboil the possum twice to render the fat, then bake it slow with sweet potato chunks until the meat fell from the bone. The dish was not pretty, it was not refined, it was wild meat stretched with garden starch, feeding a cabin that had no chicken left in the yard. Possum and sweet potatoes appeared in Christmas suppers across Sunflower County right through the 1930s, all the way to the start of World War II. Your kin hunted it, the cabin cooked it. Your great aunts remembered the taste for 60 years. It was the meal that said, the woods will provide what the landowner will not. Number 24, molasses pulled candy. Before there were corner stores stocked with penny candy, there was this. A woman in Macon, Georgia, made it on her back porch in 1964 using blackstrap molasses, a cup of sugar, a tablespoon of butter, and a splash of vinegar. She boiled it to the hard cracked stage, poured it on a greased plate, and when it was cool enough to touch, she buttered her hands and pulled it. She pulled it like rope, stretching and folding it until it turned from dark brown to a golden amber. Then she snapped it into pieces and laid them on wax paper. Molasses was cheap because it was a byproduct of the sugar refining process, and for generations, it was one of the few sweeteners Black families in the rural South could afford. The pulling was the part that required the skill. You had to know the exact moment when the candy was cool enough to handle, but warm enough to stretch. That moment lasted about 90 seconds. Your grandmother did not set a timer, she just knew. Number 25, rinsing rice in cold water 3 times before it ever touches the pot. A blue speckled bowl on a porcelain sink in 1949 Charleston. Your big mama poured the long grain in, swirled it twice with her fingers, and tipped the cloudy water down the drain. She did it again, and then a 3rd time until the water ran clear as a creek in March. What most people miss is that supermarket rice came dusted with talc and broken starch, the kind that'd turn a pot of clean white rice into glue by supper time. Edna Lewis wrote about this same trick in her notebooks from Freetown. The rice, once rinsed, sat in a cast iron pot with a pinch of salt and a tablespoon of bacon fat, simmered 18 minutes, and lifted off the spoon in single grains that held their shape under a ladle of pot lacquer. Modern cooks call it gourmet technique. Your big mama called it Wednesday. Number 25, fried fatback. Long before anybody called it a heart wrist, this was the slab that held a Sunday breakfast together. Fatback is the firm layer of pork fat off the hog's back, sliced thin, dredged in cornmeal, and crisped in its own grease until the edges curled like brittle. Our grandmothers kept it because it was cheap and it stretched, a leftover cut handed down from slavery days when the meaty parts went to the big house. By the early 1960s, after Ansel Keys landed on the cover of Time in 1961 and the American Heart Association issued its first warning about saturated fat, that crackling slab became one of the foods the new Fat and Heart message singled out. Some county nutrition pamphlets told families to render less and fry less. Folks went right on doing it anyway because fatback was flavor and survival in one pan. Health officials warned against the grease, but the table remembered the taste. Number 22, sausage gravy over biscuits. Inside every black household kitchen in the South Carolina Low Country sat a tube of cheap breakfast sausage and a sleeve of canned biscuits from the dollar store cooler. The sausage went into a hot, heavy skillet first, broken up with the back of a wooden spoon, browned until the edges caught and the fat ran clear. 3 heaping spoons of flour were stirred into the drippings to make a quick roux. Then evaporated milk and water were added slow, whisked steady until the gravy thickened into a slow pouring river. The Pillsbury biscuits popped open from the can with a satisfying smack, baked off in 10 minutes, split with a knife while still steaming. Gravy ladled over the open biscuit until it ran off the plate onto the napkin. This breakfast carried black grandfathers to the steel mill at 5 in the morning and church mothers to choir rehearsal at 6 in the evening. The whole pan cost under $2 in 1986 and fed 4 hungry working people. Sausage gravy was Southern luxury at Southern black prices. Number 17, lead glazed earthenware. The handsome clay pots and bean crocks that came up from Mexico and out of old country kilns carried a danger nobody could see. That bright glassy glaze got its shine from lead, and when it was not fired hot enough, the lead never fully fused. Pour something acidic into one, a pot of beans, a stew with tomato, a jug of tea left to sit, and the lead leached straight into the food. Families used these vessels for years, prizing them for their looks, never knowing they were seasoning every meal with poison. Lead does its worst damage to children and the unborn, dulling the mind in ways that never come back. The FDA moved to block it, prohibiting any cookware that leaches lead from being sold or imported, and ordering tainted pottery seized at the border. A pot that looked like heritage and beauty turned out to be a slow poison pulled from the shelves to protect the youngest at the table. Number 21, sweet potato pone. This was not sweet potato pie and not sweet potato casserole. Sweet potato pone was older than both. The recipe appeared in handwritten church cookbooks from the 1880s across Georgia, Alabama, and the Mississippi Delta. Raw sweet potatoes were grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with molasses, butter, eggs, and spices, then baked slow until the top cracked and the center set dense and dark, almost like a pudding. It took close to 2 hours in a wood-fired oven. The texture was heavy, somewhere between cornbread and fudge, and it was eaten warm with nothing on top. Grating enough sweet potato for a family of 8 meant raw knuckles and sore arms. When canned sweet potatoes and pre-made pie crust showed up in stores in the 1950s, sweet potato pone was one of the first recipes to drop out of the rotation. Nobody noticed until the hands that grated them were gone. Number 18, hoe cake with cane syrup. Cornmeal, hot water, a shake of salt, and a flat pan over a low flame. That was the whole recipe. A widow in Macon, Georgia in 1980 made hoe cakes the way the people in the field used to make them on the blade of a hoe held over coals. She poured the batter thin so each cake was about the size of her hand, browned each side until it crisped at the edges, then stacked 3 on a saucer. The cane syrup came out of a small Staines can she had nursed for 2 months. She poured a slow puddle of dark syrup over the top cake and ate them with a fork at the kitchen table, alone with the radio on low playing gospel from WIBB. The whole supper cost about 12 cents. 3 whole cakes filled her up better than a fast food sandwich, and the syrup gave her enough sugar to make it to morning without the shakes. It was a hug in a bowl. Number 21, salt pork gravy, overday old biscuits. No biscuit was ever thrown out in a black household in 1960 because a tough biscuit became the foundation for the cheapest gravy on the planet. 2 small cubes of salt pork rendered in a skillet until the bottom was coated in golden fat. A heaping spoon of flour stirred into the grease-brown slow, and then a cup of evaporated milk thinned with water got whisked in until the gravy was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. The yesterday biscuits, hard and a little stale, got split open and laid in the bowl, and the gravy poured over them softened them right back to fresh. Working families in Memphis and Birmingham ate this twice a week through the winter months. It used what was already in the kitchen. It cost about a dime in ingredients, and it sat heavy enough to last a full morning of work. The plate went out the door warm, and the bowl came back empty by the second swallow. Number 25, tomato and okra pilau. This was a low-country meal that traveled from the rice fields of South Carolina into every kitchen where a black woman knew how to stretch a dollar. A can of tomatoes, a handful of okra, a cup of rice, a spoonful of bacon grease, salt, and water. 30 minutes later, you had a thick, savory pot that tasted like someone had been cooking all day. The bacon grease gave it a depth that had no right being in a meal that cost so little. In the 1960s, a retired domestic worker in Beaufort, South Carolina, named Viola Simmons, made this 3 nights a week on $6 a week for groceries. The whole pot cost less than 50 cents and fed her for 2 days. She told her pastor it was the only meal that made her kitchen smell the way her mother's house used to smell back when the family was still together. She wasn't trying to be a chef. She was trying to feel less alone. That was enough. Number 12, smoked sausage and grits. Before the fancy shrimp and grits that restaurants charge $18 for, there was this. A woman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, would slice smoked sausage into thick coins, fry them in a skillet until the edges curled and browned, then serve them over a bowl of creamy grits with the rendered fat poured right on top. The sausage cost about 40 cents a link in the 1950s. The grits cost even less. 1 link of sausage sliced across could top 4 bowls of grits. That was 4 breakfasts for under $1. This was engineering. Think about what the food industry did to this meal. They took the grits and put them in a single serve instant packet. They took the sausage and turned it into a frozen patty wrapped in plastic. They separated the ingredients, processed them, and sold each one back to you at 3 times the price. But in the 1950s, a black grandmother in Louisiana did not need the food industry. She needed a pot, a skillet, and 10 minutes. She could feed her family a hot breakfast every morning of the week for less than the cost of 1 box of cereal. That math was not accidental. That was how she kept everyone alive, and the meal was better than anything you could buy in a package because it was made in a kitchen that smelled like smoke and butter and someone who knew your name. Sweet potato pie. A church supper in Macon, Georgia in 1954 set the pie out beside greens and ham. The orange flesh of the boiled sweet potato had been mashed with eggs and butter and milk and a little sugar, poured into a buttery crust and baked until the top set into a soft sheen. The pie carried beta-carotene that the body converts to vitamin A, more per cup than any other common American vegetable. The eggs carried choline. The butter carried vitamins A and D. The crust carried the patience of a woman who had rolled dough by hand for 40 years. The 1990s called pie unhealthy and pushed fat-free yogurt instead. That yogurt aisle is now full of added sugar. The sweet potato pie never needed to apologize for itself. The orange-fleshed root that crossed the Atlantic, fed children through the Depression, and became the centerpiece of every black church supper from 1900 forward, never needed a marketing campaign. It just kept showing up on the table. Number 1, number 25, corn pudding. Plain cornbread spent all year feeding the family. But on Easter Sunday, that same cornmeal got dressed up. 6 ears of fresh corn scraped into a bowl with eggs, whole milk, and real butter, baked until the top turned golden and the inside set into a custard so soft you needed a spoon to serve it. This was the dish that said humble ingredients could be sacred if you treated them right. Enslaved people had survived on cornmeal rations all year long, 1 peck per week. That was the standard. So when Easter came and a free black woman turned that same grain into something worthy of the risen Lord's Day, she was rewriting what cornmeal meant. By the 1970s, corn pudding was a standard Easter side across the South. Today, over 80% of corn pudding recipes use canned corn and Jiffy mix. The custard version, the one that required patience and fresh eggs and a kitchen that smelled like spring, has nearly vanished. Your grandmother did not need a recipe. She needed a cast iron dish and 45 minutes. Number 8, chicken and dumplings, the cheap parts version. Chicken backs ran 29 cents a pound at the meat counter in Memphis in 1984. A grandmother dropped 1.5 pounds into a heavy pot with 8 cups of water, a chopped onion, 2 stalks of celery, 3 peppercorns, and a bay leaf. She simmered it 90 minutes, pulled the bones out, picked the meat off, and strained the broth back into the pot. Then she made the dumplings. 2 cups of self-rising flour, a 1/4 cup of Crisco, and enough buttermilk to bring it into a shaggy ball. She rolled it thin on the counter, cut it into ragged squares with a butter knife, and dropped the squares into the simmering broth one by one. 20 minutes covered. The dumplings puffed up tender and pale. She ladled it into a bowl with a scoop of the picked chicken meat. The whole pot ran her about 80 cents and fed her 3 suppers. Your grandmother had made it the same way in 1949 when grief sat at her table. Number 15, lamb's quarters and dock greens. These were the forage greens that cost nothing and grew everywhere a sharecropper looked. Lamb's quarters came up in the disturbed soil at the edge of plowed rows. Doc pushed up along the dirt roads between cabins. An elder in Coahoma County, born in 1875, could walk 50 yards from her front porch and bring back a basket of greens for supper. She washed them 3 times in well water to get the field dust out. Then they went into a pot with a piece of fatback and simmered until the bitterness cooked out. The greens turned a deep, almost black green. The pot lacquer turned thick. Foraging filled the gap between what the landowner allowed in the garden and what a family of 9 actually needed to eat. The fields belonged to the planter. The roadsides belonged to whoever knew how to look. She knew every weed by name, knew which would feed you and which would kill you, and she taught her daughter before that daughter could read. Number 16, peanut patties. These were flat, round discs of pink candy studded with roasted peanuts, and in the 1960s, you could find them in every gas station, general store, and candy counter across the Black South. A woman in Tyler, Texas, made hers from scratch using sugar, corn syrup, peanuts, butter, and a few drops of red food coloring that turned the whole batch the color of a sunset. She poured the hot candy onto wax paper in circles the size of her palm and let them harden in the evening air. Tyler Candy Company began producing peanut patties commercially around this same time and has been operating in the same facility for more than 70 years. But the homemade version, the one your aunt made on the stove and wrapped in cellophane for church fundraisers, that version is the one that is gone. The store-bought patties survive, the kitchen version does not. Number 24, knocking the cast iron skillet to test the heat before the lard ever went in. A Kentucky kitchen in 1958. The pan had been her mother's, then her aunt's, then hers. Big Mama would drum the iron rim with the back of her wooden spoon and listen for the change in pitch, a low, ringing tone that said the pan was ready. Cold iron answered dull. Hot iron answered like a bell. Once the bell rang, she dropped a pinch of cornmeal into the dry pan. If the meal danced and browned in 3 seconds, the chicken went in. If it didn't, she waited a beat longer. There wasn't a thermometer, an infrared gun, or an app. There was a woman, an iron pan, and 40 years of knowing. The fried chicken came out crackling. The skin shattered. The meat was juicy enough to drip down the wrist of the child who ate it, standing at the counter. Year after year, that same pan rang the same bell. Number 22, smothered pork chops. Smothering was the art of taking a tough, cheap chop and drowning it in gravy until it surrendered. The chops were browned in lard, then left to simmer low under a thick roux gravy built from the pan drippings and flour until the meat fell soft and the gravy ran rich and brown over the rice. It was a way to make a hard cut tender and a small portion feel like plenty, a survival skill passed down through hard times. When the saturated fat warnings spread in the 1960s, that lard and drippings gravy was precisely the cooking style the New Heart guidance flagged, all that rendered pork fat thickened and poured over everything on the plate. County home economists sometimes urged families to skim the fat or skip the gravy altogether. The kitchen heard the advice and kept the spoon in the skillet. They tried to thin the gravy down, but the family kept it thick. Number 18, salmon croquettes. But salmon was canned, not fresh, and that was the whole point of the recipe. A 14-ounce tin of pink salmon from the Piggly Wiggly sat at $1.20 in 1985, and one can feed a family of 4 when stretched correctly with the right binder. The fish was flaked into a wide mixing bowl, bones and all, mixed with yellow cornmeal, a beaten egg, finely chopped onion, a shake of Old Bay, and a dash of cracked black pepper. The bones were soft enough to mash with a fork and added a quiet dose of calcium that nobody talked about, but every grandmother knew about. Patties were shaped by hand, flattened to the thickness of a deck of cards, fried in hot oil until the crust turned mahogany brown, served with grits and grape jelly in the morning or rice and brown gravy in the evening. The croquette was the black southern dish that traveled north during the Great Migration and stayed on the Sunday breakfast table. Salmon croquettes were the Depression recipe that outlived the Depression. Number 20, small turtles under 4 inches. Snapping turtle and pond turtle were honest food in many Southern black households, caught from the creek and cooked into stews and fried turtle that stretched a week's eating. Children kept the tiny ones in dime store bowls, and the small turtle trade boomed in pet shops nationwide. The trouble was salmonella. The little turtles carried it on their shells, and outbreaks of it kept landing children in hospitals across the country. In 1975, the FDA banned the sale of any turtle with a shell under 4 inches long, the size that ended up in a child's hands and then a child's mouth. The rule did not touch the big turtles cooked for the pot, but it gutted the trade in the small ones and reshaped how families could keep them. A creature that had fed and entertained folks for generations got its smallest version pulled from every shelf to stop the spread of a kitchen sickness. Now, back to the list. Number 23, poke salad. The plant grew wild along fence rows and ditches across the South, and in spring, when the pantry was at its emptiest, women went out with a bucket and picked the young leaves before they turned toxic. Poke salad had to be boiled 3 separate times. The water poured off between each boil because the mature plant is poisonous. The The old cookbooks were specific about this. 3 waters, no shortcuts. After the third boil, the greens were fried in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. It was bitter, earthy, and free. The dish showed up in community cookbooks from East Tennessee to the Alabama Black Belt, always with the same warning about the 3 boils. Skip one and you would know it. Wild food foraging is trendy now, but for Black families in the rural South, it was Tuesday. Nobody called it foraging, they called it getting by. Number 22, pot liquor over day-old cornbread. A widow in a brick walk-up in Gary, Indiana in 1977 never threw out the liquid at the bottom of a greens pot. That dark, salty broth, the pot liquor, was a meal in itself, the way her people had eaten it since the slavery years when the masters ate the leaves and the enslaved drank what was left. She would crumble a square of yesterday's cornbread into a deep bowl, ladle the warm pot liquor over it until the bread soaked through but still held shape, then eat it slowly with a spoon, sometimes a single boiled egg sliced on top, sometimes a few drops of pepper vinegar. The whole thing took 4 minutes to assemble and cost her almost nothing because the broth was a byproduct, not a recipe. It carried iron, calcium, and the memory of every collared pot her mother had ever cooked. They were following a memory. Number 12, liver mush, slices with hot coffee. Liver mush was the cheap North Carolina cousin of scrapple, and in Black households across the Piedmont, it carried the cold months from October through to March. The loaf came wrapped in waxy butcher paper for about 30 cents a pound in 1963, less than half the price of any cured pork on the same counter. It was ground pork liver mixed with stone ground cornmeal, dried sage, and plenty of black pepper, then chilled solid in a loaf pan overnight until it cut clean. 2 cold slices hit a dry pan first thing in the morning and crisped up dark brown on both sides in under 5 minutes, no extra grease needed. A thick slice on a piece of light bread with a smear of yellow mustard fed a grown man straight through to his lunch break, and the mug of strong black coffee beside it finished the meal off.
Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze turned weekend gatherings into sweet, smoky celebrations in African-American neighborhoods across the 1970s. Meaty pork ribs were marinated in apple cider, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar, then slow roasted or charcoal grilled until the meat was fall-apart tender. Midway through cooking, the ribs were brushed with a thick cider glaze that caramelized over the heat, creating a sticky surface that clung to every finger. The scent of roasting pork and sweet apples drifted across backyards, drawing neighbors and cousins long before dinner was served. Served with potato salad, baked beans, or simple white bread, the dish balanced tang and richness perfectly. It was both a nod to Southern barbecue traditions and a chance to add a fruity twist that felt fresh for the decade. Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze embodied the joy of family cookouts, where music played late into the evening and every plate carried the flavor of smoke, sweetness, and laughter shared outdoors.
Number 15, fried apples with fatback. In the fall, when the trees were heavy and the mornings were cool, this was the breakfast that made the kitchen smell like something sacred. A woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, would fry thin slices of fatback until crisp, remove them from the pan, then add sliced apples directly into the hot pork fat. The apples turned soft and golden. The natural sugars caramelized against the salt of the fat, and the whole skillet smelled like autumn on a plate. She might add a pinch of cinnamon. She might add a spoonful of brown sugar. But most of the time, the apples and the fat were enough. This was a seasonal breakfast. It only happened when the apples came in, usually September or October in the Upper South. The rest of the year, you ate something else, and that is part of why it disappeared. People stopped eating with the seasons. They wanted apples in January. They got them from a store, but those apples did not taste like the ones from the tree your grandmother knew. Bone broth congee, A pot of pork bones simmered 6 hours over a low burner, then long grain rice added for another hour until the grain broke down into a thick, spoonable cream. A cook in Birmingham ladled it into a chipped white bowl and handed it to a child sick in bed. She had learned the dish from her mother. Her mother had learned it from a neighbor. The broth carries glycine and proline, the amino acids that support gut lining repair. The dish was dismissed in 1990 dietitian columns as old country food. By 2016, it was on the menu at wellness clinics in Los Angeles for $15 a bowl. She was 30 years ahead of the trend. She didn't bill for it. She didn't write a book about it. She just made the pot, ladled out a bowl, and handed it to you when you were sick. Number 8, potato salad. In Black families, the question who made the potato salad is not casual. It is a security check. The wrong person's potato salad at Easter dinner could ruin their entire holiday, and everybody at that table knows it. Easter potato salad was a specific production, not the mayo heavy deli version. This was mustard forward, egg studded, with sweet pickle relish that turned it a distinctive yellow. Made the day before to let the flavors meld. Served cold, 5 pounds of potatoes, 8 eggs, 1 cup of yellow mustard. The dish migrated north with the Great Migration and became standard at every Black gathering in northern cities. The designated potato salad maker in a family or church held a position of trust earned over years. You did not volunteer for that job. You were chosen. The tradition even traveled to Washington, D.C., where Easter Monday at the National Zoo became a massive gathering. By 1919, 55,000 Black Americans came to celebrate. Potato salad was there on every blanket and every table. That gathering started in 1891, the direct result of segregation at the White House Easter egg roll. Even joy had to be built from scratch. Number 19, spam and rice with onion gravy. A retired shipyard welder in Newport News kept a blue can of spam in his pantry the way other men kept the Bible. He sliced it thin, browned the slices until the edges blackened, then set them aside. In the same skillet, he sweated a yellow onion in the spam fat, stirred in 2 spoons of flour, and poured in a cup of water and a spoon of kitchen bouquet. The gravy thickened in 3 minutes. He laid the spam over a plate of Uncle Ben's rice and ladled the gravy over the top. A can of spam ran 99 cents. The plate fed him twice. The Navy had served him SOS on a Tuesday in 1968. He still ate it on a Tuesday. Your body remembers the comfort that fed it longest. Number 3, parched cornmeal coffee. By the late 1930s, real coffee from Brazil was a luxury most Black tenant families could not justify on the furnish account. A pound of Maxwell House cost a quarter in 1937, when a sharecropper's whole week of cash earnings might be $1.50. So Delta cooks improvised. They spread cornmeal in a dry cast iron skillet and roasted it slow over a low fire until it turned dark brown and smelled like burnt toast. The parched meal got steeped in boiling water, strained through a piece of clean flour sack, and poured into a tin cup. The result tasted vaguely like coffee, vaguely like roasted grain, and entirely like a kitchen that refused to give up its morning ritual. Cornmeal coffee was poor man coffee, but it was hot, and it was the morning's first comfort. That mattered when the day ahead was 12 hours in a cotton row. She drank it standing up at the stove before the sun came up over the field. Custard. This was not pudding and it was not ice cream, though it lived somewhere between the two. A woman in Durham, North Carolina, stood at her stove stirring a pot of milk, egg yolks, sugar, and vanilla over low heat until it thickened into a pourable custard, the color of pale butter. She never stopped stirring, not once. If you stopped stirring, the eggs would scramble and you would have to start over. She served it warm in a teacup on Christmas Eve, and her family drank it the way you would drink cocoa, slowly, standing near the fireplace. Boiled custard was a staple of Black Southern holiday traditions from the late 1800s through the 1960s, and the skill it required was the reason not everyone could make it. 3 generations watched her stir that pot, and not one of them could replicate the exact consistency. She said the custard would tell you when it was done by the way it coated the back of the spoon. Her hand knew the thickness. Nobody else could feel it. Number 8, Number 21, salting the meat the night before you cook. It, a Birmingham kitchen in 1955. Big Mama unwrapped a pork shoulder from the butcher paper and rubbed kosher salt deep into the fat cap with both hands. She covered it loose with a dish towel and slid it onto the cool side of the icebox. By morning, the salt had drawn the moisture to the surface, then pulled it back in along with every grain of seasoning. The meat cooked tender enough to fall off the bone with the back of a fork. Restaurant chefs would later call this a dry brine and write whole books about it. Big Mama called it leaving the meat alone overnight. She had learned the same trick from her own grandmother, who had learned it on a tobacco farm in 1898. The salt did the same work in every kitchen. The patience was the seasoning. Number 18, country ham. Salt was the whole reason this ham survived a southern summer without a refrigerator, and salt was exactly why officials grew nervous about it. Country ham is cured deep in salt, then hung and aged for months until it is firm, dark, and intensely savory, sliced thin and fried with red-eye gravy made from the drippings and a splash of coffee. The method came out of necessity, a way to keep meat through the year on land where ice was scarce. By the 1960s, researchers were already documenting that high blood pressure hit Black Americans harder and earlier, and the sodium in heavily cured meats like country ham drew attention from the new public health focus on salt. Health messaging of the era began urging families to ease up on the saltiest cuts. The ham still hung in the smokehouse, and the skillet still spat what the doctors called sodium, the kitchen called keeping the meat alive. Number 21, hot water cornbread. The hot water cornbread was the trick that separated grandmothers who could cook from those who only thought they could. Yellow cornmeal went into a wide bowl with a heavy shake of salt on top, and boiling water poured straight from the tea kettle while a wooden spoon stirred fast. The dough firmed up into a thick paste hot enough to burn your hand if you rushed it. Patties were shaped between 2 wet palms and dropped into ½ an inch of hot bacon grease in a heavy skillet. 2 minutes aside, crisp golden outside, steamy and soft inside. No oven, no rising time, no buttermilk needed, no eggs to spare. A working mother in Mississippi could put a stack of 6 on a table in under 15 minutes, alongside greens and beans and whatever scrap of pork was bubbling in the pot. Black grandmothers in the Mississippi Delta swore the trick was the tea kettle, not the cornmeal. Hot water cornbread was speed cooking before anybody invented the term. Number 22, saccharine. By the 1970s, it had become the standby in countless Black kitchens. The little tablets dropped into coffee, and the powder stirred into pitchers of tea for anyone told to ease off the sugar. It was older than cyclamate and had outlasted it, the survivor of the artificial sweeteners. Then, in March of 1977, the FDA announced it intended to ban saccharin too, citing Canadian studies that found bladder cancer in male rats fed heavy doses. The outcry was immediate. Congress stepped in and saved the sweetener, but it did not let it off clean. Lawmakers signed the Saccharine Study and Labeling Act in November of 1977, forcing every package and product to carry a stark warning that it had caused cancer in lab animals. So the powder stayed on the table, but now it spoke a warning every time you reached for it. The sweetness our elders trusted came wrapped in a federal caution that followed it for decades. Number 14, neckbone purlieu. Along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, in the Low Country where African, Caribbean, and Southern food traditions mixed for 300 years, rice was the center of the plate. Purlieu was the dish that made the least amount of meat feed the most people. Smoked pork neck bones were simmered in water with onion, garlic, and bay leaf until the broth was rich and the meat was tender enough to pull clean. Then raw rice was stirred directly into the pot and the lid sealed. The rice absorbed every trace of smoke and fat and salt. The word purlieu likely comes from pilau, a technique that traveled through Persia and West Africa before arriving in the Low Country with enslaved people who already knew how to cook rice better than anyone on the continent. 2 or 3 neck bones, which cost almost nothing because nobody with money wanted them, could produce enough purlieu to fill 8 or 10 plates. A single pot, 1 burner, rice that cooked in its own sauce. The Gullah Geechee communities along the Sea Islands kept this tradition alive longer than most, but by the 1990s, the old-style purlieu was fading. Neck bones cost more now. The young people moved to Atlanta and Charlotte, and the rice that once grew in those same coastal fields has not been commercially harvested in South Carolina since the early 1900s. The old community cookbooks from Beaufort and Charleston recorded what the hands already knew: a cup of rice per person, enough broth to cover by 1 inch, and the patience to leave the lid alone. Number 7, Hoppin' John for 1. A small saucepan, a 1/4 cup of dried black-eyed peas she had soaked the night before, a single strip of bacon, a handful of rice, an onion, a bay leaf. That was the full inventory for a retired church organist's supper in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1979. The Gullah Geechee people had made Hoppin' John on New Year's Day for 2 centuries because black-eyed peas were thought to bring luck and rice was the staple of the Low Country. She cooked the peas first until tender, then added the rice and bacon to the same pot with 2 cups of the cooking water. 20 minutes covered. The rice swelled, the peas softened the rest of the way, and the bacon flavored every grain. She ate a bowl on Monday, a bowl Tuesday, and stretched the last of it into a hot lunch on Wednesday with a few drops of pepper sauce. About 45 cents fed her 3 days. Poverty does not care where your people came from. Number 16, mush and molasses. The cheapest thing a sharecropper's wife could put on a plate in 1962 was a bowl of hot cornmeal mush with a spoon of dark molasses cut through the middle. The math told the whole story. Cornmeal at 18 cents for 5 pounds, molasses at 50 cents a quart, and 1 pot of water from the well. That bowl of breakfast worked out to less than 2 cents per serving, and it filled up a grown man until dinner. The mush got stirred slow for 15 minutes so it stayed smooth, then poured into a wide bowl while still steaming. The molasses sank down to the bottom in dark ribbons, and the spoon caught a little of both with every bite. Tenant farming families across Arkansas and Mississippi ate this 6 mornings a week for most of the decade. It was the food of people who counted every coin, but the warmth of it kept whole households going through the coldest months of the year. Number 9, oxtail stew. Oxtails were the scraps. Butchers sold them for almost nothing because most customers didn't know what to do with them. In 1968, a pound of oxtails cost 25 cents. A senior would brown them in a pot, add onions, carrots, potatoes, garlic, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover everything. Then the pot went on the lowest flame and stayed there for 4 hours. The meat fell off the bone and the marrow dissolved into a broth so rich it coated the back of a spoon like velvet. A retired hospital orderly in Atlanta named Clarence Simmons made oxtail stew every other Sunday from 1970 until 1985. He bought the oxtails at a butcher on Auburn Avenue who saved the tails for him every week because nobody else wanted them. Today, those same oxtails cost $9 a pound. What was once the cheapest cut in the store is now priced like a luxury. Time equals 1 second / greater. Number 22, buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup. In the 1950s, Alaga cane syrup was a staple on black breakfast tables across the South. Women in Mobile, Alabama, would pull a pan of biscuits from the oven, split each one open, lay a pat of butter inside, and pour a ribbon of dark cane syrup over the top. That was the whole breakfast some mornings, just biscuits and syrup. The Alaga brand was so popular in black households that the company marketed directly to African American communities for decades. A bottle cost about 20 cents in 1955. The syrup was thick, dark, and had a deep sweetness that refined sugar could not match. Children soaked their biscuits until the bread was almost translucent. The syrup pooled on the plate and you used your finger to get the last of it. This was not poverty. This was simple. This was a woman turning flour and sweetness into something her children remembered for the rest of their lives. They were following a memory. Hog maw stuffed. The pig stomach scrubbed in cold water, stuffed with sausage, diced potatoes, cabbage, and onion, sewn shut and baked low for 3 hours until the casing went tender. Pennsylvania Dutch families made it. So did black families across the Carolinas. The dish put a whole meal in one organ and used every cheap ingredient on the kitchen table. Hog maw is mostly muscle protein with collagen woven through it. The dish fell out of favor in the 1980s when grocery stores stopped carrying the stomach at all. Today, nose-to-tail chefs in New York charge $30 a plate to recreate exactly what a cook in Charleston fed 7 children for under 3. The plate is the same. The bill is different. Her name doesn't appear on any of those restaurant menus. She wrote no cookbook. She just kept feeding her people. Number 11, roast leg of lamb. Black preachers drew a direct line from the Israelites, marking their doors with lamb's blood, to black families surviving slavery and Jim Crow. If you sat in that pew, you understood. Easter lamb was not just dinner. It was theology you could taste on your own plate. In rural southern communities through the mid-20th century, many black families kept small flocks of sheep. Edna Lewis, born in Freetown, Virginia, a farming community founded by freed slaves after the Civil War, described spring sheep shearing as a community event. The lamb would be roasted whole or as a leg for Easter Sunday. A whole leg of lamb averaged $4.50 per pound in 2000. It now runs $9 to $12, putting a 7-pound leg at $63 to $84. United States lamb production has declined roughly 85% since the 1940s, from over 56 million sheep to under 5 million. As black families urbanized and moved north, access to fresh lamb declined. Ham took over as the default Easter meat. The lamb and its sermon disappeared together. Number 1, pan-fried liver pudding. In the Carolina Piedmont, a roll of liver pudding from a country grocery ran $1.19 in 1984 and lasted a single senior the better part of a week. A grandmother in Greensboro sliced the pudding into half-inch rounds, dredged them in flour, and pan-fried them in 2 spoons of bacon grease for 3 minutes aside until the edges crisped and the middle stayed soft as pate. She slid 2 rounds onto a square of Wonder Bread, smeared a stripe of yellow mustard across the top, and folded the bread in half. A glass of cheerwine on the table, a spoon of Smucker's apple butter on the side for the second slice. The whole supper cost about 30 cents. Your great-grandfather had eaten the same sandwich on a tobacco farm in 1934. She had eaten it in 1955 when she first moved to Greensboro. She was eating it now alone in 1986 with the television on a low blue glow. The recipe was regional. Your need for it was not. Number 23, peach cobbler. A can of peaches, a cup of batter made from flour and sugar and milk, and butter melted in the baking dish. You poured the batter in first, spooned the peaches on top, and the batter rose around the fruit as it baked. A can of peaches cost 19 cents in 1955. The batter cost less than a dime. In the church basements of black congregations across the South, peach cobbler appeared at every supper and every funeral repast. Church, women competed over their cobbler, whose crust was crispier, whose filling held together when you cut it. A woman's reputation could rise or fall on a single pan. That cobbler was not a dessert, it was a credential. The women who made the best ones never wrote the recipe down. They carried it in their hands. Blackberry dumplings. In the 1960s, if you lived in the rural South, blackberries grew wild along every fence line, ditch bank, and wood edge from June through July. They were free. All you needed was a bucket and long sleeves to protect your arms from the thorns. A woman in Meridian, Mississippi, picked 2 quarts of blackberries. Before 7 in the morning, brought them home, simmered them with sugar and water until the juice ran dark purple, then dropped spoonfuls of dumpling batter into the bubbling fruit and covered the pot. The dumplings steamed inside that blackberry syrup until they were pillowy and stained violet all the way through. This was a one-pot dessert that could feed a family for the cost of a cup of flour and a cup of sugar. The berries were free from the land. Black families relied on foraging like this for generations, turning what grew wild into something that tasted deliberate. When families moved from the country to the city, the fence lines and the berries stayed behind. The dumplings went with them. Number 6, fried okra. Number 17, smothering meat in its own, steam under a heavy lid for 90 minutes. A Saturday afternoon in 1952, New Orleans, the rain coming sideways off Lake Pontchartrain. Big Mama browned 6 pork chops in bacon grease, lifted them out, and dropped 2 sliced onions into the same pan. The onions melted. She poured in 2 cups of water, set the chops back in the pan, and clamped the lid down tight. The fire went to a whisper. The meat cooked in its own steam for 90 minutes. The onions broke down into a mahogany gravy. The chops came out tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Edna Lewis wrote about smothering as the heart of country cooking. The technique wasn't a recipe, it was a relationship between heat, water, and patience. Modern cooks rush the same dish in a slow cooker and wonder why the meat tastes flat. Big Mama could have told them, the lid is the secret, the time is the seasoning, the patience is the love. Number 19, neck bones. There was always more flavor than meat on a neck bone, and that was exactly the point. These knobby pork bones were sold cheap, sometimes nearly given away, and a cook would brown them and let them go low and slow with onion and a little water until the gravy turned deep and the scraps of meat slipped right off. They seasoned a pot of beans or stood alone over rice, a survival dish that fed a family on next to nothing. When the 1960s heart message took hold, neck bones drew notice on 2 fronts: the rendered pork fat, the new saturated fat guidance warned about, and the salt that seasoned the pot. Nutrition leaflets of the day nudged families toward leaner, lower salt cooking. The cook nodded and reached for the neck bones just the same. Officials measured the fat and the salt, and the family measured the gravy. Number 24, Pinto beans and ham hocks. Open the bag of dried pinto beans, and you're looking at the cornerstone of the 1980s soul food pantry. A pound sold for 50 cents at the Piggly Wiggly, and a single smoked ham hock costs less than $1.50. Soak the beans overnight in a cold pot of water. The next morning, drain them, add the hock, cover with fresh water, and let it bubble all afternoon. The pork fat melted into the broth and turned plain beans into something that tasted like Sunday. Grandmothers in Birmingham and Memphis kept this pot going on the back burner from Monday through Wednesday, adding water as it cooked down. Served over rice with a slice of raw onion on the side, it fed 4 working adults for under $3. Church kitchens used the same trick for fellowship suppers, doubling the recipe in a stock pot the size of a car battery. Pinto beans were the workhorse of every black kitchen that survived the Reagan years. Number 24, sassafras root. This was the root that gave old homemade root beer its deep, woody bite, and it brewed the sassafras tea that simmered on stoves across the rural South every spring. Folks dug it from the woods, boiled the bark, and drank it as a tonic to thin the blood after a long winter. The smell of it filled kitchens from Appalachia down to the Gulf. Then researchers isolated saffron, the oil that gave sassafras its flavor, and fed it to lab animals. It caused liver cancer in the rats, and the agency moved fast. In 1960, the FDA banned saffron as a food additive, which pulled real sassafras out of root beer and bottled drinks for good. The tea hung on in country kitchens a while longer, traded hand to hand, but the commercial route was finished. A flavor that once meant springtime and homemade soda was struck from the food supply by federal order. Number 18, pepper vinegar. On nearly every table in the rural Black South, next to the salt shaker, sat a glass bottle filled with hot peppers and white vinegar. It showed up in community cookbooks not as a recipe, but as a given, the way flour might appear. You pack small hot peppers into a bottle, covered them with vinegar, and let it sit on the counter for a week. The vinegar turned amber, then orange. A few drops went on collard greens, black-eyed peas, turnip greens, and anything else that needed heat. Nobody bought hot sauce when the pepper bottle was already there. When you ran low, you just added more vinegar and let it sit another few days. The bottle was never empty and never finished. When Tabasco and Louisiana brand hot sauce became cheap and everywhere in the 1970s, the homemade bottle slowly disappeared from the table. Number 11, pig feet and rice. Pig feet sat in the butcher's case at 39 cents a pound in 1978, and seniors knew exactly what to do with them when most younger cooks would not look twice. A retired postal worker's widow in Houston's 3rd Ward simmered 2 split pig feet in a covered enamel pot for 3 hours with a quartered yellow onion, a stalk of celery with the leaves still on, a bay leaf, 2 cloves of garlic, and a generous shake of red pepper flakes. The meat between the toes pulled off in soft, gelatinous, deeply flavored bites that tasted faintly sweet from the collagen. The broth thickened on its own as it cooked until it was almost a jelly when cold. She ladled the hot feet and broth over a bowl of plain white rice and ate it on Wednesday night with a few shakes of hot sauce and a piece of pickled okra on the side. The leftover broth set up overnight in a glass bowl into a savory aspic. She sliced thin and ate on a saltine cracker for Thursday breakfast. 2 pig feet, 3 meals, less than $1 all in. This was arithmetic. This was survival. Number 25, fried cornmeal mush with cane syrup. For most black families in 1960, the morning started with a pot of yesterday's mush sliced into squares. The rule was simple. Cook a heavy pot of cornmeal on Sunday night, pour it into a loaf pan, and let it set in the icebox until it was firm enough to slice. By Monday morning, a quarter-inch slab hit the hot grease and crisped up dark brown on both sides. A spoon of cane syrup or molasses went over the top, and that was breakfast for a working man or a school child. Cornmeal sold for about 18 cents for a 5-pound sack in 1960, which meant a family could eat from that one bag for almost 2 weeks. Nothing got thrown away. The crumbs that fell off the cutting board went into the chicken bucket on the back porch. Number 4, catfish stew. Catfish was the fish of the Black South. It swam in every river, every creek, every pond where a man could drop a line with a worm and a prayer. A senior who could still get to the water could eat for free. You filleted the catfish, cut it into chunks, and dropped it in a pot with potatoes, onions, a can of tomatoes, a little hot sauce, salt, and pepper. 20 minutes of simmering, and the fish flaked apart into the broth, and the potatoes thickened it into a proper stew. A retired tire plant worker in Akron, Ohio, drove back to his hometown of Greenville, Mississippi every summer to fish. He caught enough catfish to fill a cooler and drove it back north. He made catfish stew once a week all winter long. His neighbors could smell it in the hallway and would knock on his door asking for a bowl. He never said no. He said a man who eats alone when he doesn't have to is a man who has forgotten what food is for. A pound of catfish from the river cost nothing but time. A pound from the store cost 89 cents in 1976. Either way, the stew was a full meal. Number 5, biscuits and sawmill gravy. This was not restaurant food. This was a woman with a skillet and nothing else to work with. A woman in Decatur, Alabama, would fry a little ground pork or a few slices of bacon, leave the drippings in the pan, stir in flour until it turned golden, then slowly pour in milk while scraping the bottom of the skillet. The gravy thickened in minutes. She poured it over biscuits she had baked in a cast iron pan that had been in her kitchen for decades. The gravy got its name from the sawmill workers in Appalachia who ate it to survive long shifts. But in black households across the South, it had a different name. Some called it white gravy. Some called it milk gravy. Some called it nothing at all. The ingredients were flour, milk, fat, salt, and pepper. That was it. 5 things. This breakfast held families together through the Depression, through the war years, through the decades when work was scarce and dignity was not optional. Your grandmother called it breakfast. Number 4. Number 17, dandelion greens salad. Every spring, a woman in rural Tennessee walked the back lot with a paring knife in her apron pocket, looking for the young leaves before they bloomed. She cut them low, washed them in cold water, and tossed them with hot bacon grease, cider vinegar, a pinch of sugar, and a hard-boiled egg crumbled on top. Dandelion greens carry more vitamin A per cup than spinach, plus inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds the bacteria in your gut. The 1980s called dandelions a lawn problem and recommended weed killer. By 2018, specialty grocers were selling the same leaves for $4 a bunch. Number 7, red drink. Shut out of the White House Easter egg roll. By segregation, black families in Washington built their own celebration. By 1919, 55,000 people showed up at the National Zoo on Easter Monday, and the red punch they served traced the line back 400 years to West Africa. The original red drink was hibiscus-based. Enslaved people in the American colonies adapted the West African hibiscus tea tradition using local berries when the flowers were unavailable. The red color carried spiritual significance in West African cultures that survived the Middle Passage. Adrian Miller, the soul food historian, documented this journey in detail. By the 1920s and 1930s, Commercial products like Kool-Aid and Big Red soda began replacing the homemade version. The hibiscus punch vanished. But here is what stayed in your culture: the insistence on red. Not any color, red. At black gatherings across America, the red drink endured even after nobody remembered why it had to be red. 4 centuries of cultural memory compressed into a color. The recipe is gone, but your instinct remains. Chips. Before frozen breaded okra showed up in grocery bags, there was this. A woman in Montgomery, Alabama, sliced fresh okra into thin rounds, tossed them in cornmeal seasoned with salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne, and fried them in a shallow pool of oil until they turned into crunchy chips you could eat by the handful. In the 1960s, okra was one of the most common vegetables in any black southern garden because it grew well in heat and poor soil, both of which the South had in abundance. Okra has deep roots in West Africa, where it was used in stews and soups for centuries before it crossed the Atlantic. The fried version was a porch snack, something you ate standing up while waiting for supper to finish. A woman in her garden could pick the okra, slice it, fry it, and have it on a plate in less than 20 minutes. That speed was the recipe. That garden was the store. Number 5, peanut. Number 22, soaking dried beans overnight with a teaspoon of baking soda in the water. A Memphis kitchen in 1962. Big Mama dropped a pound of dried pintos into a chipped enamel bowl, covered them with cold water, and stirred in a single teaspoon of soda from the orange box on the shelf. The beans drank the water, the skins softened. The soda neutralized the gas compounds that had ruined a Sunday afternoon. By morning, the beans had doubled in size. She drained them, rinsed them once, and simmered them with a smoked ham hock and 1 chopped onion. The pot took 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. She saved gas, she saved time, she saved your granddaddy the embarrassment of a long car ride home from church. The trick traveled with her family from Tennessee to Detroit during the Great Migration, and her granddaughter was still doing it in a Cleveland apartment in 1991. Number 17, candied yams. Sweet, glossy, and dark with brown sugar, candied yams were the dish that made a holiday plate feel like a celebration. They are sweet potatoes, slow cooked under a thick glaze of butter, brown sugar, and warm spice until the edges go syrupy and the whole pan shines. The name is a thread back to West Africa, where enslaved cooks recognized the sweet potato as kin to the yams of home and cooked it the way they remembered. As the 1960s brought new attention to what families ate, the sheer amount of sugar in dishes like candied yams drew quiet caution from nutrition writers worried about Southern cooking. Home economists sometimes suggested cutting the sugar down by half. The cooks smiled and kept the glaze deep because this was not everyday food. It was Sunday and Thanksgiving on a fork. They counted the spoonfuls of sugar, but the family counted the smiles. Number 17, spaghetti with ground beef. Stretch 1 pound of ground chuck across 5 hungry mouths, and you have the math problem every working black mother solved every Thursday night in 1986. Half a pound of meat browned in a heavy pot with chopped yellow onion and green bell pepper. The grease drained off into an empty coffee can on the back of the stove. Then a can of generic store-brand tomato sauce, a can of stewed tomatoes, a teaspoon of sugar to cut the acid, garlic powder, dried oregano if you had it on the spice rack, salt and pepper to taste. The sauce simmered low for 30 minutes while the cheap, thin spaghetti noodles boiled in a separate pot of salted water. A working mother of 3 in Cleveland could put this plate on the table in under 25 minutes flat after walking in from her second shift. With a slice of buttered white bread and a tall glass of red Kool-Aid, The whole supper came in under $3. Spaghetti night fed the family of 5 for under $3, exactly as your grandmother always promised it would. Number 16, red dye number 2, the colorant called amaranth. This was the red that made the red, the dye that gave the candy on the church table and the cake on the holiday sideboard their deep festive color. Before red velvet leaned on beet juice and modern dyes, red number 2 was the workhorse in the punch, the frosting, the penny candy children begged for. It was in everything bright and sweet. Then the lab work came back grim. By 1969, the dye had been tied to a rising count of tumors in tested rats, and the worry only grew through the early 70s. The agency held out as long as it could, then gave way to the evidence. In 1976, the FDA banned red dye number 2 from the American food supply, scrubbing it out of the candy and the cakes where it had lived for generations. A color that had meant celebration on Black family tables was delisted by federal order, sent the way of every additive that could not survive a closer look. 17. Watermelon rind preserves. The red flesh was eaten fresh. The rind was not thrown away. In old cookbooks from the Carolinas and Georgia, watermelon rind was peeled, cubed, soaked in lime water overnight to firm it up, then simmered for hours with sugar, lemon, and ginger until it turned translucent and sweet. The result was a clear, jewel-like preserve that tasted nothing like watermelon. Closer to candied ginger, delicate and strange, it kept in mason jars for a full year. Making it was an all-day job. The peeling alone took an hour, but it came from the part of the fruit that everyone else threw in the compost pile. In a kitchen where waste was not just frowned on, but genuinely could not be afforded, this preserve was an act of precision. Every part of the fruit had a purpose. Number 3, sardines and saltines supper. Number 3 on this list outlasted 3 power outages on the Gulf Coast in 1979 and never needed a stove. A retired Steve Doer's widow in Mobile kept a small tin pyramid of King Oscar sardines and a sleeve of premium saltines in the cupboard for the nights when the heat was high and the gas bill was higher. She would peel back the lid of one tin, lay the sardines on 5 saltines, add a few drops of hot sauce and a slice of raw onion, and that was supper. About 30 cents per tin. The oil from the can went on to the last cracker, eaten last like a small dessert. 3 tins carried her a week if she did not feel like cooking. She would put the radio on, sit at the kitchen window, and eat slowly because nobody was waiting on her. It was for her. Number 19, smothered onions on toast. When there was no meat at all, a skillet of slow smothered onions over day-old bread was breakfast. 2 large yellow onions went into the pan with a spoon of saved drippings, and the heat stayed low for almost 20 minutes. The onions cooked down to a soft brown jam that smelled like supper instead of sacrifice. 2 slices of bread, toasted dry in the oven, got covered with the warm onions and eaten with a fork. It was the kind of breakfast nobody bragged about, but it kept the body going on a morning when the icebox was almost empty. Then number 8, lima bean and ham hock pot. Lima beans were the workhorse of the Southern pantry. They were bland on their own, which is exactly why they worked. They absorbed whatever flavor you gave them. A ham hock, a pod of dried red pepper, an onion, and a pot of water turned a bag of dried lima beans into a smoky, spicy, filling meal that cost almost nothing and lasted for days. You soaked the beans overnight, dropped them in the pot with the ham hock in the morning, and walked away for 3 hours. By the time you came back, the kitchen smelled like a holiday. A retired laundress in Montgomery, Alabama, made lima beans and ham hock every week from 1966 to 1981. A 1-pound bag of dried lima beans cost 45 cents. A ham hock cost 30 cents. For 75 cents, She had food for 4 days. She never called it cooking. She called it surviving. Jessica B. Harris, the food historian, has written that this is the cycle of African American foodways. What the family ate became what the family was told to stop eating, became what the food world rediscovered, always in that order. The woman in Tennessee never stopped. She kept walking the same back lot with the same paring knife in the same apron pocket every spring for 60 years. Number 4, Easter coconut cake. The hours of hand grating fresh coconut that enslaved women performed in plantation kitchens was forced labor disguised as domesticity. They cracked whole coconuts and grated the meat by hand, a process that could take hours for a single cake. But when those same women baked coconut cake for their own families after freedom, that labor became something else entirely. An act of love so powerful it defined Easter for generations. The original coconut cake required 2 to 3 whole coconuts. In the 1880s, a single coconut cost 10 to 15 cents. The white coconut connected symbolically to Easter's themes of purity and resurrection. Edna Lewis, born in Freetown, Virginia, a community founded by freed slaves, wrote that coconut cake was one of the most famous desserts her community baked. Abby Fisher's 1881 cookbook included a coconut cake recipe, one of the oldest known, published by an African-American author. By the mid-20th century, bagged sweetened flake coconut replaced the fresh. The cake lost its texture, its labor, and its meaning in the same generation. The women in your family who could crack a coconut and turn it into Easter are nearly all gone. What replaced them came in a plastic bag. Number 18, finishing the gravy with a tablespoon of cold butter swirled in off the heat. A Thanksgiving morning in 1957, Charlotte, the roasting pan held 2 cups of dark drippings and a slurry of flour and water whisked smooth. Big Mama brought it to a simmer, scraped every brown bit off the bottom, and turned the burner off. Then she dropped a cold pat of butter, half the size of a matchbox, into the center of the gravy and swirled the pan in a slow circle. The butter melted as it moved. The fat coated the starch molecules. The gravy turned glossy and thick, the kind of finish a French chef would call mounted with butter and charge you $80 for at a hotel. Big Mama called it the last shine. She did the same thing to the pot liquor, the red-eyed gravy, and the pan sauce. The trick cost 3 cents and made every plate look like the cover of a magazine. Number 14, ham hocks. One smoked hock could flavor a whole pot and feed a whole table, which is exactly why it sat at the center of so many soul food kitchens. The hock is the joint above the pig's foot, smoked and salt cured, dropped into beans or greens to give the whole pot its deep, smoky backbone. It was the cheapest of cuts, the kind handed down from slavery when the good meat went elsewhere, and it became the seasoning that defined the cooking. By the 1960s, the ham hock drew notice on both counts that worried officials. The cured salt that the new blood pressure concern flagged, and the pork fat the heart studies warned about. Public health messaging of the era leaned on Southern families to season with less salt-cured meat. The cooks listened politely and dropped the hock in the pot all the same. The bulletin saw salt and fat. The family saw the soul of the dish. Number 14, Sunday smothered chicken over rice. Some Sundays in our 1980s, kitchens smelled exactly like this dish from the moment your feet hit the kitchen linoleum. The whole fryer chicken cost $2.90 at the A&P in 1985, cut into 8 pieces by the butcher behind the counter who knew your grandmother by her first name. Each piece was patted dry with a paper towel, dusted in seasoned flour, heavy with paprika and black pepper, and dropped one at a time into a Dutch oven with a 1/4 inch of hot vegetable oil. The skin hissed and bubbled and turned the color of an October leaf. The smell that came off that pan was the smell of safety, the smell that told you Sunday dinner was real and the week was finally over. The browned pieces came out onto a plate. Half the oil was poured off. The remaining grease was loosened with 3 heaping spoons of flour, stirred into a roux the color of peanut butter. 2 cups of chicken broth went in slow, whisked until smooth, then a sliced yellow onion, a teaspoon of garlic powder, a pinch of thyme. The chicken pieces returned to the gravy. The lid went on. The whole pot simmered for 40 minutes on a low flame while the rice cooked in a separate pan and the greens finished on the back eye. The kitchen filled with steam that fogged up the window over the sink, the same window your grandmother had been looking out of for 30 years. A scoop of rice went onto the plate first. A piece of dark meat went on top. Gravy ladled over the rice until it pooled at the edge of the plate. A slice of hot water cornbread off to the side. The smell of paprika and onion and chicken fat hung in the kitchen until Monday morning. Sunday smothered chicken was the meal that proved a hard week ended in a soft place. The plate cost under $4 and tasted like a memory you could chew. Number 18, brominated vegetable oil. This one hid in plain sight the additive that kept the citrus flavor from floating to the top in orange and lemon lime sodas. Those bright bottles were a fixture at the cookout and the church picnic, lined up in the cooler beside the sweet tea, and brominated vegetable oil was what kept them looking right. Most folks drinking them never knew the name, but bromine builds up in the body over time, and studies done with the National Institutes of Health found it could harm the heart and the thyroid at the levels people actually consumed. The evidence finally tipped the scale. On July 3rd, 2024, the FDA revoked the rule that had allowed brominated vegetable oil in food, ordering it out of the soda supply for good. An ingredient that had ridden along in our drinks for decades, doing its quiet job, was pulled the moment the science caught up with it. Molasses pulled candy. Sugar was expensive, molasses was not. The candy recipe that appeared most often in the old cookbooks was molasses pulled candy. Molasses boiled with a little vinegar and butter until it reached the hard, cracked stage, then pulled by hand while it cooled. Pulling was the work. 2 people stood across from each other, stretching the hot rope of candy until it turned from dark brown to pale gold. Children watched from the kitchen table. The pulling changed the texture from sticky to brittle, and when it cooled enough, it was cut into small pieces and wrapped in wax paper. The kitchen smelled like burnt sugar for the rest of the night. It was the only candy most rural Black children ever tasted outside of Christmas, and most of them remember the pulling more than the eating. Number 12, number 2, fried bologna and rice. 3 thick slices of beef bologna from the deli counter on Florida Avenue in Tampa cost a widow 25 cents in the spring of 1978. She slit a small X in the center of each slice with a paring knife so they would not dome up and curl on themselves in the pan, then fried them in a dry black skillet over a medium flame until the edges crisped into dark brown ruffled rings. The slices went over a scoop of white rice with a teaspoon of yellow mustard, a sliced sweet pickle on the side, and a few shakes of red pepper sauce. The smell was childhood itself for anyone who had grown up Black in the rural South or in a northern walk-up apartment in the Great Migration years. 3 slices made 2 meals on the same plate. The pan was wiped out clean with a piece of paper towel, no soap, the way her mother had always done it. Your grandmother called it supper. Number 13, hog jowl with black coffee. A single thin slice of smoked hog jowl with a cup of strong black coffee was the breakfast of men who had to be at the mill or the field by sunrise. The jowl came from the cheek of the pig and cost almost nothing because most white grocery stores did not want it. In a soul food household, it was treasured. One slice in a hot pan rendered into smoky brown grease and curled up crisp at the edges. The coffee, boiled in a battered enamel pot and poured strong enough to stand a spoon in, washed it down. There was no toast, no eggs, no fuss. Just meat, fat, and heat in the belly with the smell of wood smoke still in the cured pork. Black families in the Carolinas and Tennessee mountain country ate this 6 days a week through the winter, and grandmothers swore it was what kept the men working past sundown without sitting down once.
Cowpeas and rice pilaf offered a taste of Carolina heritage that African American families carried forward with pride during the 1970s. Dried cowpeas soaked overnight were simmered gently with smoked turkey wings or a ham hock until tender, releasing a broth rich with earthy flavor. Long grain rice was added to the pot, soaking up the seasoned liquid and transforming the dish into a complete meal. Onions, celery, and a hint of thyme gave the pilaf a savory depth, while a dash of hot pepper added subtle heat. Served with cornbread or fried green tomatoes, it filled bellies and satisfied the craving for something both nourishing and steeped in tradition. This was a dinner that honored the resilience of generations who turned humble ingredients into lasting comfort. It carried the memory of fields and family gardens while fitting neatly into busy urban kitchens. Cowpeas and rice pilaf reminded everyone that simple foods, cooked with patience and love, could rival any fancy restaurant meal when shared around a welcoming table. Pine needle tea offered a bright and restorative drink when fresh produce was scarce during cold months. Enslaved foragers collected the youngest green needles from longleaf and loblolly pines, rinsed them carefully, and steeped them in hot water until the brew released a light citrus aroma. Rich in vitamin C, this tea helped ward off scurvy and brought a welcome freshness to winter diets heavy with salt-preserved foods. The practice echoed both indigenous traditions and West African herbal knowledge, merging two continents' wisdom into a single sustaining cup. Families continued to brew pine needle tea well after emancipation, and it remains popular among modern herbalists for its gentle flavor and reputed immune-boosting qualities. Its evergreen scent and warm golden color remind us that even in the most barren season, the forest offered nourishment. Pine needle tea illustrates how observing the land and respecting its cycles allowed people to find both medicine and comfort, turning what others overlooked into a sustaining daily ritual that strengthened body and spirit alike.
Number 3, gumbos or herbs. Every Holy Thursday in New Orleans, Leah Chase stood in the kitchen of Dookie Chase's restaurant at 2301 Orleans Avenue in the Trim and made gumbos of herbs. She did this for over 46 years straight. 9 different greens: collards, mustard greens, turnip greens, beet tops, cabbage, lettuce, watercress, spinach, carrot tops, mixed with smoked andouille, hot sausage, ham hock, chicken, and brisket. Superstition held that you would gain as many new friends in the coming year as there were greens in your gumbo, but you could never use an odd number. That was considered deeply unlucky. Leah insisted on 9 because her grandmother taught her 9. The dish was a collision of West African stew traditions and German Catholic Holy Thursday soup customs that met in Louisiana in the 1700s. Black Creole families in the Trim and 7th Ward neighborhoods adapted and enriched both. Leah Chase was called the Queen of Creole cuisine. Presidents, civil rights leaders, and people just like you came for this once-a-year dish. She served it until her death in June 2019 at age 96. After that, the gumbo continued, but the hands that made it legendary did not. Number 15, brining the chicken in salted water with a bay leaf for 4 hours before frying. A Friday afternoon in 1963 Jackson, Mississippi. Big Mama, Mixed a quarter cup of kosher salt into a half gallon of cold water, dropped 2 bay leaves into the brine, and submerged a cut up chicken in the bowl. She covered it and left it on the cool tile floor of the pantry for 4 hours. The salt traveled into every fiber of meat. The water locked itself in. By the time she dredged the chicken through her seasoned flour, the meat was already a third of the way to perfect. She fried it in lard at 350 degrees for 14 minutes. The skin came out the color of a Carolina pine cone. The white meat was juicy enough to leave a slick on the plate. Her grandchildren would tell you nobody since has ever made fried chicken that good. Number 15, collard greens cooked with fatback. A pot of greens without a piece of pork in it was, to most Southern cooks, hardly a pot of greens at all. The tough collard leaves were stripped, chopped, and left to simmer for hours with a chunk of fatback or a ham hock until they turned silky and the cooking liquid deepened into pot liquor, the savory broth that got sopped up with cornbread. The greens themselves came up out of necessity, but it was the pork fat and the long simmer that gave them soul. When the saturated fat message reached Southern kitchens in the 1960s, the fatback in the greens and the fat-rich pot liquor were exactly what the New Heart guidance pointed at. Nutrition advisors suggested cooking the greens leaner with less pork and less rendered fat. The cooks heard them and reached for the fatback anyway because greens were memory in a pot. They warned about the fat in the liquor and the family drank it down with bread. Number 15, chicken backs and rice. Across every Black-owned grocery store in the South in 1985, the meat case held a styrofoam tray of chicken backs marked at 39 cents a pound. Most white customers walked past them. Most Black customers loaded 2 trays into the cart and knew exactly what they were doing. The backs went into a heavy pot with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and just enough water to cover. 45 minutes of slow boiling pulled the meat off the bones and turned the cooking water into a rich amber stock. The stock was strained and used to cook a pot of long grain rice. The meat was picked off, mixed back in. A whole pan of supper for a family of 4 came in at under $1.50. Chicken backs were the secret cut nobody wrote about, but everybody ate. Number 14, beef brain and spinal cord. Nothing was wasted in the soul food tradition, and the head of the steer was no exception. Brain was scrambled with eggs for breakfast, soft and rich, a dish poor families across the South knew well. The spinal cord and the tender odd cuts went into stews and gravies. This was the deepest kind of thrift, the cooking born of having to use everything because the choice cuts went elsewhere, and it produced flavors that fancier kitchens never bothered to chase. Generations grew up on brains and eggs the way others grew up on bacon. Then came mad cow disease. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy turned out to spread through exactly these tissues, the brain and the spinal cord and the nervous system, where the infectious agent gathered thickest. A human form of the disease, fatal and untreatable, could pass to anyone who ate the wrong part of an infected animal. The danger was not a stomachache, it was a sponge slowly eating holes in the brain with no cure and no coming back. So the government drew its hardest line on the parts that had fed the poorest cooks the longest. In 2004, the USDA prohibited the use of specified risk materials in human food, banning the brain, the spinal cord, and the nervous tissue of older cattle from ever reaching a plate. Brains and eggs, a breakfast that had stretched a family's food for over a century, was outlawed in a single rule. It is the cruelest kind of irony in this whole list. The very thrift that kept people alive, the refusal to waste a single part of the animal, became the exact thing the science said could kill you. A tradition built on dignity and survival was ended not because it was poor cooking, but because a disease had finally given the agencies no other choice. Jerusalem artichoke relish. The Jerusalem artichoke is not an artichoke and has nothing to do with Jerusalem. It is a sunflower root native to this continent, and it grew wild across the South in thick patches along creek beds and open fields. Black families in rural Mississippi and Alabama dug them up in autumn and turned them into relish, peeled, chopped fine, mixed with onion and green peppers, packed in vinegar and sugar, and canned in mason jars. The relish was sharp and crunchy, served alongside roasted meat or on top of field peas. The recipes appeared in handwritten community cookbooks from small black churches in the Delta, passed around at church suppers, and preserved in collections that most libraries never cataloged. The tubers are still growing wild today. Nobody picks them anymore. Number 1, souse meat sandwich open face. Tuesday afternoon in 1977, in a small kitchen in Augusta, Georgia, a retired church seamstress would unwrap a 35-cent slab of souse meat from the deli paper, that gelatinous, vinegar-tanged head cheese made from pork bits set in their own broth, and lay 1 cold quarter-inch slice on a buttered piece of light bread, a spoon of yellow mustard, a slice of sweet onion, half a pickled green tomato on the side. She ate it open-faced with a knife and fork at the kitchen table, while the afternoon program played on a small black and white set in the corner. Souse went back to the cabin years when no part of the hog was wasted, and it was still on small kitchen tables across the rural South a century later. 1 slab fed her 3 suppers. That was enough. Pick one of these and put it on the stove this week. Not because it is cheap, even though it is. Number 9, chicken livers and onions on toast. A paper tub of chicken livers cost almost nothing at the butcher counter, and a black grandmother could turn it into a hot breakfast that tasted like restaurant food on a Saturday. A half-pound ran about 18 cents in 1962 because most white grocery customers walked right past the livers and headed for the breast meat. The livers got rinsed cold, patted dry, then dredged in seasoned flour, heavy with salt, black pepper, and a shake of paprika. They dropped into a hot pan of bacon drippings alongside a thick sliced yellow onion. 6 minutes later, the livers were dark brown outside and just pink in the middle, and the onions had collapsed into a deep dark gravy at the bottom of the pan. 2 slices of toasted day-old bread went on the plate, the livers spooned over the top with all the pan juices.
Cowpea fritters were a dish that came straight out of resilience and memory, with roots reaching back to African cooking traditions. Families would soak and mash dried cowpeas, mix them with a little onion, cornmeal, and seasoning, then fry the mixture in hot lard until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They were cheap, filling, and carried the rich protein that many households could not always get from meat. For Black families in the South, cowpeas were already a staple crop, so using them to create something hearty made perfect sense. These fritters could be eaten plain or dipped in gravy, and they were often made in batches large enough to last a day or 2. They carried a deep sense of history, because this kind of cooking showed how old world techniques adapted to the realities of hard times in America. They were not only nourishment, but also a connection to ancestors who had relied on the same beans for strength. Field green salad was a dish born from foraging, when store-bought vegetables were not available or were too costly. Families would gather wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed, clean them carefully, and toss them with vinegar or oil. These greens were bitter, but they were free, nutritious, and available almost everywhere. Field green salad offered vitamins and freshness that was often missing from wartime or depression diets, balancing the heavy starches and salted meats that dominated many meals. For children, it was sometimes an acquired taste, but adults appreciated the practicality of gathering what nature provided. Foraging for greens tied families directly to the land and created a sense of connection to survival practices passed down through generations. Field green salad reflected both hardship and resilience, reminding families that the earth itself could provide when markets could not. It was simple, frugal, and a reminder of the strength that came from resourcefulness.
100 meals, 100 ways a grandmother said, "I love you," without ever speaking those words. If you grew up eating any of these dishes, or if there is one your family still makes every Sunday, share it in the comments. Subscribe so you never miss another trip back to Big Mama's kitchen.